You can't see it, but your body still remembers the tail it once had. Buried at the base of your spine is a silent remnant of an ancient loss, one that helped reshape the human body forever. But losing our tails was not a clean upgrade. It came with a hidden cost, one written into our balance, our backs, our birth, and the way we move through the world even now. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy, because this is the story of how humans lost their tails and why our bodies may still be paying for it. At the very bottom of the human spine, where the back narrows and the pelvis closes around its hidden architecture, there is a small structure that feels almost like an afterthought. It is easy to ignore, easy to forget, easy to treat as one more obscure feature tucked away beneath muscle and ligament and skin. Yet it is one of the strangest clues in the human body. There, fixed at the base of the posvenochna column, sits the coccyx, a few fused bones, modest and diminished. The residue of something much older. It does not wave. It does not balance us on branches. It does not flick in anger, curl in fear, or swat away insects in the heat. But it remains, quietly, as evidence that the human body was not always built the way it is now. Long before cities, before tools of metal, before language took its modern forms, before even the earliest recognizably human ancestors walked across African ground, our lineage belonged to a world in which tails were ordinary. We are the descendants of animals for whom a tail was not decoration, but equipment. Their absence is the real mystery. Human beings are surrounded by mammals with tails. Cats write moods with them. Dogs broadcast excitement and uncertainty through them. Monkeys use them as counterweights, signals, and in some lineages even as grasping tools. A tail is such a common part of vertebrate design that its disappearance from our own body plan feels less like a standard feature than a subtraction. It is as if something has been removed from an ancient blueprint, and the shape left behind never quite stopped showing. Every person carries that subtraction. Every person carries a body that has been reorganized around a loss. And the loss was not free. The human body is often admired for what it gained: hands precise enough for tools, shoulders capable of throwing, a pelvis reshaped for upright walking, feet turned into rigid platforms, and a brain expanded far beyond the primate norm. But evolution is not an engineer building clean upgrades. It is a long series of compromises, patched together from old material. Each new advantage leans on older structures that were designed for other purposes, under other conditions, in landscapes now gone. When one piece changes, everything around it must adapt. Sometimes the adjustment works elegantly. Sometimes it works just well enough to keep a lineage alive. And sometimes a vanished structure leaves a bill that descendants continue paying millions of years later. The missing human tail belongs to that kind of story. Imagine, for a moment, an ancestral primate moving through a high canopy. Branches cross in layered green shadow. Depth is difficult to judge. One misplaced reach means a fall. In that world, the body is not only a mass to be hauled upward or forward, it is a device for staying alive among moving supports. Balance matters constantly. Momentum matters. Turning matters. Leaping matters. A tail is useful there in ways that are almost hard to appreciate from ground level. It can shift the body's center of mass. It can steady motion. It can communicate with others in a group. In some species, it becomes so specialized that it acts almost like an extra limb. For millions of years, a tail is not a leftover from some primitive past. It is a practical answer to a real problem. And then, somewhere along the line that leads toward apes and eventually toward us. That answer begins to disappear. Not all at once, not as a single dramatic event visible in one clean fossil. Evolution rarely leaves behind moments so neatly labelled. What survives in the record suggests a more complicated process changes in anatomy, posture, movement, and development, accumulating across deep time until a familiar structure becomes smaller, less functional, and finally absent on the outside altogether. The evidence remains incomplete, as it so often does when dealing with ancient bodies made mostly of soft tissue and fragile bone. But the pattern is unmistakable. Our branch of the primate family tree does something unusual. It leaves the tail behind. At first glance, that may sound trivial, compared with the evolution of a language, tool-making, fire, hunting, art, agriculture, cities, and science. A tail can seem minor, almost comic. But the farther one looks into the body, the less minor it becomes. Remove a tail from an animal lineage and you're not just trimming an appendage. You're changing balance. You're altering the spine's terminal structure. You're reshaping muscle attachments. You're affecting locomotion. You may even be changing how an animal signals to others, how it sits, how it stabilizes itself, how its young develop in the womb. No single explanation fully accounts for this shift because the shift itself is embedded in a wider transformation. Tail loss does not happen in isolation. It belongs to a reorganization of the body. In humans, that reorganization becomes extreme. We're not just tailless apes. We are upright apes. We are long-distance walkers. We are animals whose spine is loaded vertically through a posture that our distant mammalian ancestors never knew. We carry the head differently, balance the trunk differently, and bear weight through the pelvis and lower back in ways that come with obvious strengths and equally obvious weaknesses. Human lower backs fail often. Discs wear down. Nerves compress. Muscles strain. The coccyx itself, small as it is, can become inflamed, bruised, or painfully unstable. Sitting can hurt. Childbirth can injure. Age can stiffen what was already a compromised structure. The elegant image of human evolution often hides this fact: our bodies are full of old bargains. The coccyx is one of the quietest reminders. It is not useless. Strictly speaking, muscles, tendons, and ligaments anchor there. It helps form part of the pelvic floor's support system. It remains integrated into the body's architecture. Yet its presence feels like a riddle, because it is both functional and vestigial, both necessary in its current reduced form and plainly descended from something much larger. In rare medical cases, human infants are born with tail-like structures, startling reminders that development still carries traces of an earlier design. These are not evidence that human beings are somehow reversing evolution in any simple sense, and scholars are careful about the distinction between true vestigial tails and other protrusions formed during development. But such cases matter because they reveal how deep the old pattern still runs. Our species does not merely remember the tail in theory. In the earliest stages of embryonic growth, the human body briefly builds one. That fact alone changes the tone of the mystery. The tail is not an abstract ancestral rumour. It is part of the script still written into us, even if later development edits it back. Human embryos, for a brief period, display a tail-like extension containing multiple vertebrae. Then, through the processes of growth, reabsorption, and restructuring, that extension is reduced. What an adult body carries is the remnant, not the full expression. In other words, the modern human form is achieved not because the ancient pattern vanished entirely, but because it is interrupted. We begin closer to that older vertebrate inheritance than we end. There is something haunting in that. Evolution is often imagined as forward motion, one clean stage replacing another. Real bodies tell a stranger story. They preserve old plans under new surfaces. They reuse ancient materials. They conceal history inside anatomy. The human tail did not simply disappear like a discarded tool dropped beside the road. It was folded inward, reduced, absorbed into another arrangement, and left there as a structural echo. The body moved on, but not completely. That is why the loss of the tail is not only a story about what vanished, it is also a story about what replaced it, and what replacement cost. A tail can help stabilize movement from behind. Humans must solve that problem differently. The gluteal muscles take on powerful roles in controlling the trunk and hips. The feet become arched platforms. The spine develops curves that help manage load but also create vulnerability. The nervous system coordinates balance through vision, the inner ear, joint sensation, and learned control. Nothing is free. The body compensates, then compensates for the compensation. What looks, from a distance, like a neat modern design becomes, up close, a structure full of strain. There is also a deeper irony here. The human body is often treated as the body that escaped the animal past, the body that stood up, let go of the branch, and entered history. But the more closely one examines the spine, the pelvis, and the coccyx, the less convincing that illusion becomes. We did not step outside evolution. We stepped more deeply into it. The same process that gave our lineage new possibilities also left behind old scars. The coccyx is not embarrassing because it is primitive. It is revealing because it shows how thoroughly modern humanity is built out of ancient improvisation. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy, because this story begins long before humans, and even before apes in the form we would recognize. It begins in the older mammalian world where tails are normal, useful, and nearly universal. It passes through the primate canopy, where gripping hands and forward-facing eyes evolve alongside agile spines and balancing appendages. It narrows at the branch where apes diverge from monkeys and the tail fades from view. It deepens again in the human line, where upright walking transforms the spine from a flexible bridge into a loaded column with a precarious lower end. And through every stage runs the same tension. Losing one old solution means inventing another. Scholars still debate the precise combination of forces that made tail loss advantageous, or simply acceptable in our ancestry. Was it mainly about a shift in locomotion? Was it tied to body posture, spinal mechanics, embryonic development, or some broader reorganization of ape anatomy? Did the tail become less useful first, or did developmental changes reduce it before new movement patterns fully emerged? The evidence does not deliver a single dramatic answer. Instead, it offers a trail of clues. Genes that affect tail development, fossils that chart changing bodies, embryos that replay old structures, and modern aches that hint at ancient compromise. Piece by piece, the picture becomes clearer, even if never complete. And what the picture shows is unexpectedly intimate. This is not a mystery locked in distant strata or sealed in a lost city. It is carried inside every human body, hidden in plain sight. A vanished tail still shapes the way we sit, walk, give birth, injure ourselves, and understand where we came from. It is an absence with consequences, a missing flag at the end of the spine, a structural silence left behind by millions of years of change. The human body stands upright, hands free, vision lifted toward the horizon, but at its base remains a small reminder that our form is not a final design. It is negotiated survival, and one of its oldest negotiations is written in the bones of a tail we no longer have. Word count motenghi betra moy hai, awaiting continue, deep swing hitrong wagyai section hai. Long before any creature resembling a human sets foot on open ground, long before the spine is asked to bear the full vertical burden of an upright body, the mammalian world is full of tails. They drag through grass, sweep behind running bodies, wrap around sleeping young, flick over backs in warning, and extend like living counterweights from branch to branch. In that older world, a tail is not a decorative extra. It is built into movement itself. It belongs to the grammar of survival. To understand why humans no longer have one, it helps to begin in the ages when having one is simply the default condition of being a vertebrate on land. The story reaches far past primates, past apes, past the first true mammals, into a much older inheritance. The vertebrate tail begins as an extension of the body axis, a continuation of the spine that projects behind the trunk. In aquatic ancestors, that rear extension is central to propulsion. Fish drive themselves through water with it. Early tetrapods carry the structure onto land. As limbs become more important for walking, the tail does not disappear. It changes jobs. It helps with balance, stabilization, communication, display, defense, and in some lineages the storage of fat. Evolution is not inclined to discard a structure that can be repurposed so effectively, so the tail persists, reshaped again and again according to the demands of each environment. By the time mammals diversify, the tail is everywhere, but not always doing the same work. A kangaroo uses it as a powerful balancing rod and even as a prop during slow movement. A cheetah uses it to control high-speed turns with extraordinary precision. A beaver turns it into a paddle and warning device. A horse uses it to drive away flies and signal irritation. A cat can communicate an entire mood shift with a single lift or twitch. Even among animals that do not seem especially expressive, the tail quietly handles mechanics that the rest of the body depends on. It redistributes motion. It lengthens the body's control over its own mass. It provides leverage where leverage matters. For primates in particular, tails enter an even more demanding world. The primate story begins not in grasslands, but in trees. Early primates evolve in environments where three-dimensional movement is constant and unforgiving. Branches vary in thickness and stability. Distances between supports can be deceptive. The next foothold may bend, crack, or sway. Hands and feet become increasingly good at grasping, but grasping alone is not enough. A body moving through this canopy must be exquisitely aware of its own centre of gravity. A tail can help with that in ways both subtle and dramatic. It can counterbalance a reaching arm. It can steady the body during a leap. It can help an animal brake, pivot, or redistribute weight across unstable supports. In many monkeys, that role remains obvious. One can watch a long-tailed monkey on a branch and see how naturally the appendage is folded into the logic of movement. It streams behind the body when the animal runs, curls when the posture shifts, flicks when attention changes direction. In New World monkeys, the story becomes even more striking. Some species evolve prehensile tails so refined that the tail functions almost like a fifth hand. Capable of gripping branches and sharing the load of locomotion. These tails are muscular, sensitive, and deeply integrated into daily life. They do not merely stabilize the animal, they become part of the animal's contact with the world, even in monkeys without prehensile tails. the appendage remains an active tool of balance and social expression. What matters here is not that all primates use tails in identical ways, but that the early primate body evolves in a setting where a tail makes practical sense. Forward-facing eyes improve depth perception, hands become better at grasping, shoulders and limbs adapt for climbing and leaping. The tail fits into that whole package. It is one component in a broader system built for arboreal uncertainty. Remove it too early, before other changes compensate, and the animal may lose more than it gains. This is why the human condition can seem so peculiar in retrospect. Our lineage emerges out of primates, a group for which tails are ancestrally normal, yet we belong to the branch that abandons the external tail entirely. That is not the starting point. It is the result of a later divergence. For a very long time, our ancestors almost certainly possessed tails because nearly all early primates do. The record of soft tissue is sparse, and fossil skeletons do not always preserve the full details one might wish for, but comparative anatomy makes the deeper picture clear enough. The primate inheritance begins with a tail, not without one. One of the more surprising details is how many jobs a tail can do without drawing much attention to itself. Modern humans, lacking one, often imagine tails only in dramatic terms, swinging from branches, lashing in anger, waving in excitement. But much of a tail's value lies in low-level continuous adjustment. It assists in tiny corrections of posture and momentum that prevent larger failures. The branch-walking animal does not need to think about its tail any more than a person thinks about the automatic shifts of muscles that keep the body upright while standing. The structure becomes part of the background intelligence of motion. It helps the body remain where it intends to be. That quiet contribution matters in social animals too. Primates are rarely alone for long. They watch one another closely. A tail can serve as a visible extension of emotional state and intention. It may signal tension, submission, excitement, alertness, or reproductive readiness. In some species, the tail's posture becomes woven into group life, adding one more layer to the body's communication system. Human beings eventually become masters of facial nuance, vocal complexity, and manual gesture. But early primates inhabit a world where the entire body broadcasts information, and the tail is part of that display. When one imagines the primate past accurately, it is not enough to picture hands and eyes. One must picture the whole balancing, signaling, moving body. The evidence also suggests that the environment shaping early primates are not static backgrounds but active forces in body design. Dense forest canopies reward agility, depth perception, and controlled motion. Night activity in some ancestral forms may heighten the value of tactile certainty and spatial precision. Branches do not forgive clumsy weight shifts. The difference between a safe landing and a lethal fall may be measured in centimeters and fractions of a second. A tail is well suited to that kind of margin. It does not replace skilled limbs or keen vision, but it contributes to the body's margin of error. It is one more way evolution builds resilience into a risky form of life. All of this makes the later disappearance of the tail more meaningful, not less. It is one thing to lose a structure that has become functionless. It is another to lose one that once belonged to a successful and deeply rooted way of moving through the world. The ancestral primate tail is part of a working solution, and that means its loss must either coincide with new solutions or reflect a broader change in what problems the body most needs to solve. No single explanation fully accounts for this transition, but the context makes one point difficult to avoid if tails vanish in our lineage. They do so against a background in which tails had long been useful. There is also a temptation to imagine evolution as a ladder from tailed to tailless, primitive to advanced, as if the disappearance of the tail marked an obvious improvement. The evidence gives no support to such a simple hierarchy. Tails remain extremely successful structures. Most mammals keep them because they continue to work. Monkeys keep them because for monkeys they are useful. The tailless condition of apes is not proof of superiority. It is proof of specialization. It indicates that one branch of primates enters a different adaptive zone, with different solutions and different costs. That is a more interesting story than any notion of straightforward progress. Seen in this light, our ancient ancestors in the trees are not merely primitive prefaces to humanity. They are bodies exquisitely tuned to their own world. Their tails belong to an arboreal intelligence distributed across muscle, limb, spine, eye, and balance. Their lives are shaped by the need to move above the ground without falling. They leap, cling, scramble, and reach through a landscape of vertical complexity, and the tail is there through all of it, sometimes obvious, sometimes almost invisible in its usefulness. It is part of what makes that form of life possible. And yet the primate world is never frozen. New ways of moving appear. Some lineages specialize in leaping, some in cautious climbing, some in quadrupedal branch running, some later in brachiation or other suspensory behaviors. Forests shift, climates fluctuate. Bodies that thrive in one context may become less efficient in another. Over long stretches of time, the same appendage can move from essential to optional, from central to expendable, provided enough other changes are already underway. The great puzzle of human tail loss begins there, not with humans themselves, but with the flexibility of primate evolution. The tail does not vanish because nature suddenly tires of it. It vanishes only when a lineage starts building another way of being a primate. What survives in the record suggests that this turning point belongs not to the earliest primates, but to the later emergence of apes, somewhere between the long-tailed monkey body and the tailless ape body. The old arrangement breaks, chests broaden, shoulders change, movement through trees takes on new forms, the spine and pelvis begin to belong to a different design. The tail, once normal and useful, ceases to define the rear edge of the body. When that happens, it is not only an appendage that is being lost, an entire locomotor logic is beginning to change. So the first part of the mystery is not why humans, uniquely, lack tails. Humans are not unique in that respect. The deeper mystery is why our wider ape lineage abandons a structure that had accompanied primates for millions of years, and what new kind of body emerges in its place. To answer that, one has to leave the older monkey world behind and enter a different experiment in primate anatomy, the great ape break, where the tail fades, the trunk changes, and the path toward the human spine begins to open. Word count 1760. Awaiting continue tiepja swing hitrong bongiai section ba. The break does not announce itself with drama. No single fossil rises from the ground with the label attached, declaring that this is the moment the tail is gone and the ape has arrived. Evolution almost never grants that kind of neat theatre. Instead, the evidence accumulates in fragments vertebrae, hips, rib cages, shoulder joints, limb proportions, and the subtle geometry of bodies that move through trees in ways no monkey does. Somewhere in the Miocene world, among forests that cover large parts of Africa and Eurasia, a new primate form begins to take shape. It is not human, it is not even close, but it belongs to the broader lineage from which humans will one day emerge, and one of its defining traits is a strange absence. The external tail, so ordinary in monkeys, no longer extends behind the trunk. The body has been reorganized. The old balance of parts is changing. This matters because apes are not simply monkeys with bigger brains or heavier frames. They are built differently. Their chests are broader and flatter from front to back. Their shoulders are set in ways that permit a greater range of motion, especially above the head. Their trunks behave differently in climbing and suspension. Their lower backs tend to be shorter than those of many monkeys. The whole body reflects a shift in locomotor strategy. Monkeys often move along the tops of branches in a largely quadrupedal manner, using the tail as part of an integrated balancing system. Apes, by contrast, increasingly exploit vertical climbing, hanging, cautious scrambling beneath branches, and other forms of arboreal movement that distribute weight and momentum differently. In that altered mechanical world, the tail appears to lose its old central place. Scholars still debate the exact sequence. Did the tail become less useful because ape bodies were already moving differently? Or did developmental changes reducing the tail help open the way for new movement patterns? The evidence remains incomplete, and no single explanation fully accounts for this ancient transition. But the broader outline is persuasive. The ape trunk is not a monkey trunk with the tail removed afterward like a detachable part. It is a different arrangement from the start, one in which multiple features evolve together. The loss of the tail belongs to a package deal. To picture that package, it helps to return to the forest, though not the same forest inhabited by earlier, more monkey-like primates. This is a world of thicker trunks, variable canopy pathways, larger body climbers, and greater reliance on strength, reach, and controlled suspension. A monkey running along a branch can use its tail as a highly responsive counterweight because its entire body plan supports that style of movement. A larger-bodied ape negotiating branches beneath or beside its center of mass does not rely on the same solution. As the torso broadens and the shoulders become more mobile, the body can distribute balance through other means. The limbs, trunk, and grasping extremities begin to do more of the work. The tail, once valuable, may become less essential. There is a revealing contrast in modern primates. Old World and New World monkeys retain visible tails, though not always prehensile ones. Gibbons, orangutans, gorillas, chimpanzees, bonobos, and humans do not. The difference is not random. It maps onto a deep anatomical divergence. Even the most agile and arboreal of living apes, the gibbons, remain tailless while moving through the trees with extraordinary skill. They do not need a tail to fly through the canopy in long brachiating arcs, because their whole body has been reorganized around another method of control. Their elongated arms, flexible shoulder joints, and highly specialized trunk permit a style of movement that solves the problem differently. That does not prove brachiation caused tail loss. Many early apes were probably not brachiators in the modern gibbon sense. But it demonstrates that once the ape body evolves far enough away from monkey-style quadrupedalism, the tail is no longer the obvious tool it once was. The spine itself begins to tell part of the story. Monkeys generally have longer, more flexible lower backs and a tail extending from a sacrum that leads into multiple caudal vertebrae. In apes, the number and configuration of vertebrae shift. The lumbar region shortens in many lineages, and the external tail disappears, leaving only internal terminal elements that are reduced compared with those of tailed relatives. The body becomes more compact through the trunk. That compactness helps with certain kinds of climbing and suspension, especially in larger-bodied animals that must control powerful upper limbs and shifting loads in the trees. The rear of the body no longer trails into a balancing rod. It ends differently. and that new ending is part of a broader mechanical rearrangement. One lesser-known detail is that taillessness in apes is so consistent that it likely marks one of the clearest anatomical signatures of the clade. It is easy to focus on intelligence or size or social complexity when thinking about what unites apes, but the missing tail may be just as diagnostic in a practical anatomical sense. This suggests that tail loss happens early enough in ape evolution to become foundational, not a late eccentricity of one subgroup. In other words, humans inherit taillessness not as a special human innovation, but as an ape inheritance. By the time the line leading to humans begins its own later transformations, the tail is already gone from the visible body. Our species does not independently invent taillessness. It inherits the consequences of an older ape experiment. That inheritance matters because it changes the nature of the human story. If early ape evolution is where the tail disappears, then human evolution is not about losing the tail from scratch. It is about what happens afterward, when a tailless ape body is pushed into even stranger territory, habitual bipedalism, long-distance walking, endurance, altered childbirth, and a spine loaded in ways no other ape manages quite the same way. The first break, then, belongs to apes. The second, more costly transformation belongs to humans. But the two are linked. One sets the stage for the other. It is tempting to imagine the tailless ape as already somehow halfway to human, but that would distort the picture. Apes remain deeply arboreal in their ancestry and in much of their later diversity. Even gorillas, massive and often ground-based, are not built like small humans with extra strength. Orangutans move through the canopy with an almost deliberate engineering of weight and reach. Chimpanzees and bonobos divide their time between ground and trees, using knuckle walking on the ground but climbing with ease. Their taillessness does not make them less adapted to the forest. It makes them adapted to it differently. The ape body is not a failed monkey. It is another answer to arboreal life, one that leans more heavily on torso design, shoulder mobility, and limb control. What changed then is not simply the usefulness of a tail in the abstract, but the entire context in which usefulness is measured. A tail is invaluable in one locomotor regime and less so in another. Once the ape body begins specializing for larger size, vertical climbing, careful clambering, and later forms of suspension, the energetic or developmental costs of maintaining an external tail may no longer pay for themselves. Evolution does not need a structure to become harmful before reducing it. It only needs that structure to become less advantageous than the alternatives already emerging elsewhere in the body. Yet even that is probably not the whole story. Developmental biology hints that changes in the genetic program shaping the embryo may play a role that is larger than fossil bones alone can reveal. Body structures do not vanish only because adults stop using them. They vanish because the developmental instructions that build them are altered. Somewhere in ape ancestry, those instructions change in a way that reduces the growth of the tail. The adult consequences may fit well with a new locomotor strategy, but the underlying mechanism lies deeper, in the choreography of embryonic tissues and gene regulation. This is why tail loss remains such a compelling topic. It connects broad visible anatomy to microscopic developmental decisions made long before birth. There is also a quiet paradox at the center of ape evolution. In some respects, losing the tail may simplify the rear of the body. In other respects, it places greater demands elsewhere. Balance does not disappear as a problem. It has to be redistributed. The trunk, hips, and limbs must absorb roles the tail once helped perform. For arboreal apes, that redistribution works because the entire body shifts with it. But such a shift may also narrow later possibilities, or channel them into specific directions. Once the ape lineage commits to a tailless body, everything that follows must be built on that foundation. When humans later rise into more regular bipedalism, they do so not from a long-tailed monkey template, but from a tailless ape one. The base of the spine is already altered. The body's old rear counterweight is already gone. That absence becomes more consequential with time. In the trees, apes can compensate through grasping hands and feet, strong shoulders, and powerful trunk control. On the ground, for a biped, the challenge changes again. The body's center of mass must be balanced over the hips and feet with fine precision. A tail, had one been retained, might have offered one kind of stabilizing leverage, though scholars are careful not to assume it would have remained useful in the same way under bipedal conditions. What matters is that the human lineage begins that experiment already stripped of the appendage that many other mammals still use for rapid correction and balance. The ape break, therefore, becomes the hidden prehistory of the human lower back. But before that later cost comes into view, there is the mystery of how such a radical anatomical change becomes fixed at all. Tail loss must spread through populations. It must persist across generations. It must not cripple its carriers badly enough to be removed by selection. That means the tailless condition, once established, either brings enough advantage, or at least enough neutrality within a new body plan to survive the severe filtering of evolution. The old tail has not merely been reduced in one odd specimen, it has ceased to define an entire branch of primates. This is not accident. It is history written into anatomy. The fossil record of early apes is patchy and often frustrating, but the broad implication stands. By the time ape evolution is underway in earnest, the line is already moving away from the monkey formula. Tails fade from the visible outline. Bodies thicken through the trunk. Limbs and shoulders take on new roles. Movement becomes less about running along branches with a streaming counterweight and more about mastering the forest with a different set of tools. Something ancient has been surrendered, but not carelessly. The ape body has paid for its missing tail by reorganizing itself from the inside out. And in that reorganization lies the beginning of an even deeper story. Because once the tail is gone externally, the question changes. It is no longer only why the tail vanished from the body's outline. It is why the ancient blueprint that still knows how to build one is rewritten so early in development, and how a loss that begins in the embryo can echo millions of years later in the aches, vulnerabilities, and strange remnant bones at the base of the human spine. The visible tail may be gone by the age of apes, but the developmental memory of it has not yet been erased. That memory will matter. The disappearance of the tail is visible in bones, obvious in the contrast between monkeys and apes, and haunting in the human coccyx. But the deepest part of the story lies somewhere far smaller and far earlier. It lies in the embryo, in the fleeting interval when a body is still being assembled from instructions older than any species now alive. There, before posture or habit or behavior can shape a single movement, the ancient blueprint begins its work. A spine extends. Segments appear. Tissues fold and differentiate. For a brief time, the human body does something astonishingly old. It grows a tail. Not a metaphorical tail, not a symbolic reminder, a real embryonic tail-like extension, complete with vertebral elements in formation, projecting beyond the rest of the body during development. Later, much of that extension is reduced, reshaped, and effectively taken back into the final architecture. What remains is the coccyx, internalized and diminished. This brief reappearance of the old form matters because it reveals something essential about evolution. New species do not start from nothing. They inherit developmental systems built long ago, and these systems do not forget quickly. The body does not build a human spine by drafting an entirely fresh plan. It modifies an older vertebrate one. That is why tail loss is ultimately a developmental mystery as much as an anatomical one. The adult ape or human is tailless externally, but the embryo still carries the logic of a tailed ancestor, somewhere between the first patterning of the body axis and the final sculpting of the lower spine. The ancient script is interrupted. Growth that once continued into a visible appendage is curtailed. Structures are reduced. Some tissue is reabsorbed. Some is fused into a new ending for the spine. The modern body emerges not because the tail was never there, but because development no longer allows it to remain. Scholars still debate the full sequence of evolutionary events that made this reduction advantageous, but the existence of an embryonic tail narrows the possibilities. It means the lineage did not simply evolve a totally different rear anatomy from the beginning. Instead, it inherited the machinery to produce a tail and later altered that machinery's output. That distinction may seem technical, but it changes the feel of the whole story. The human body is not a tailless design in the absolute sense. It is a tailed design that has been developmentally edited, and like all edits, it leaves traces. In recent years, genetic research has added a new layer to this picture by pointing towards specific changes in the developmental mechanisms that help shape the tail region. Among the genes involved in body patterning and the growth of posterior structures, one has drawn particular attention: TBXT, sometimes called brachyury, a gene long known to be involved in the formation of the body axis and tail development across vertebrates. Research comparing monkeys with tailed bodies to apes without external tails has suggested that changes affecting how this gene is regulated may have contributed to the reduction of the tail in the ape lineage. The details are technical, and the evidence remains incomplete. But the broad implication is striking. Tail loss may have roots in a small change to the timing or interpretation of developmental instructions, a change capable of altering the visible outline of an entire clade. That kind of mutation is both dramatic and deceptively ordinary. Evolution does not always work by inventing new genes. Often it works by adjusting when, where, and how existing genes are used. A structure can become larger, smaller, or differently shaped if the developmental switches around it are changed. In the case of the tail, this means the difference between a monkey and an ape may depend not on whether one lineage possesses the concept of a tail and the other does not, but on whether certain instructions are prolonged, silenced, shortened, or redirected during embryonic growth. A small shift in the blueprint can produce a large difference in the body. What makes this especially compelling is that such a mutation would not act in isolation. Development is a tightly interwoven process. Change one component, and consequences may ripple outward. That is one reason no single explanation fully accounts for tail loss. If an alteration in developmental regulation helps reduce the tail, it may also affect neighboring structures, spinal patterning, or broader aspects of body organization. A mutation that becomes advantageous under one locomotor regime might still carry costs or trade-offs elsewhere. Evolution accepts such bargains all the time. It does not require perfection. It only requires that, on balance, a lineage remains viable. And viability can include discomfort. This is where the story becomes more human again. The same kind of developmental change that reduces a tail might also make the lower spine more vulnerable under certain conditions. Modern experiments and comparative studies have suggested that the mechanisms linked to tail loss may be associated, at least indirectly. with an increased risk of neural tube defects or other developmental complications when the process does not unfold cleanly. Scientists are cautious here, and rightly so. The evidence is still being explored, and it would be too simple to claim that one ancient mutation directly explains every spinal problem in modern humans, but the possibility is revealing. Evolutionary changes are often entangled with hidden costs. What seems like a successful transformation at the level of the species may carry a burden at the level of developmental risk. That pattern fits a wider truth about the human body. Again and again, features that define us also expose us. Our enlarged brains are linked to difficult births. Our upright posture frees the hands but strains the back. Our complex immune systems protect us, yet sometimes overreact. Tail loss may belong to the same category, a transformation absorbed into a larger and ultimately successful body plan, but not without structural tension. What survives in the record suggests that the body keeps old solutions nearby while improvising new ones, and the seams of those improvisations do not always vanish. Embryology makes this visible in a particularly unsettling way because it reveals how temporary and contingent the final human form really is. In early development, the human embryo does not look like a finished species patiently scaling up in miniature. It looks like a body passing through ancient possibilities, taking shape through stages that preserve echoes of much older vertebrate history. The tail appears, then recedes. Arches and folds emerge, then transform. Tissues that once supported one kind of anatomy are reused for another. The finished body is less a clean design than the outcome of many selective suppressions and modifications. We are what remains after ancestral options have been narrowed. Rare births make that even harder to ignore. On uncommon occasions, infants are born with tail-like protrusions. Some of these are so-called pseudotails, structures produced by underlying developmental anomalies rather than true vestiges containing the same full elements one would expect in an ancestral tail. Others come closer to genuine vestigial tails, including soft protrusions aligned with the body's ancient developmental pattern. These cases are medically rare and often sensationalized, but their real importance is quiet and scientific. They demonstrate that the developmental pathway toward a tail has not been erased beyond recognition. It can still, under unusual circumstances, break through the editing process. The old blueprint is not dead. It is usually overruled. That is a different kind of inheritance than most people imagine. We tend to think of ancestry as a list of visible traits passed down intact, but development shows that ancestry can survive as suppressed potential. A body may no longer express a structure under ordinary conditions, and yet still carry the machinery from which that structure once arose. This is why human anatomy often feels layered. It contains not only what is present, but what was prevented from fully appearing. The coccyx is the ordinary remnant. The embryonic tail is the temporary reconstruction. The rare atavistic tail is the exception that reveals the rule. There is also something sobering in the scale of time involved. The mutation, or set of mutations that helped reduce the tail in ape ancestors, likely occurred millions of years before the first humans, before the first stone tools, before savannas became central to our story, before language and fire and migration. Yet the consequences of those developmental shifts still echo now in anatomy classrooms, pediatric medicine, spinal research, and the ordinary experience of sitting down too hard and bruising the base of the spine. Deep time does not remain neatly sealed in fossils. It lingers in development. It lingers in vulnerability. It lingers in the shape of the most ordinary bones. The ancient blueprint, then, is not a static map but a living set of instructions constantly interpreted by cells, tissues, and timing. When that interpretation changes, the body changes. A tail can be shortened, hidden, or lost from view. But the cost of such a change may not be confined to appearance. It may alter the mechanics of the pelvis, the organization of the lower spine, the balance of muscles, and the risks embedded in development itself. Scholars still debate how much weight to place on any one gene or pathway, and the evidence remains incomplete. But the overall lesson is difficult to escape. The human form is built not only from innovations, but from developmental compromises written into us long before we were human. And this is why the missing tail is more than a curiosity. It is a case study in how evolution works at its most intimate level. A whole branch of primates changes because tiny alterations in genetic regulation shift the growth of the embryonic body. The adult result appears obvious: no visible tail. But beneath that apparent simplicity is a story of interrupted growth, preserved ancestry, and hidden trade-offs. The body does not simply remove an old part and move on. It negotiates with its own past. That negotiation becomes even more consequential when posture changes. A tailless ape body moving through trees is one thing. A tailless ape body beginning to rise more regularly onto two legs is another. Once the lineage that leads to humans starts asking the pelvis and spine to support habitual upright movement, every earlier compromise becomes part of a new experiment. The ancient mutation has already altered the blueprint. The tail is already gone from view. Now the rest of the body must learn how to live with that absence under the strange demands of bipedal life. The moment the body begins to live more upright, the old absence at the base of the spine changes its meaning. In an ape moving through trees, taillessness is already a fact, but it exists inside a broader anatomy still built around climbing, suspension, grasping, and a shifting relationship between trunk and branch. Once more of life begins to happen on the ground. Once the body's center of mass must be carried not across a lattice of supports, but above two legs in alternating motion. The problem becomes more severe. The spine is no longer just a flexible connector between limbs. It becomes a loaded column. The pelvis is no longer simply part of a climbing system. It becomes a bowl supporting the organs, anchoring muscles, and receiving the repeated shock of upright stride. And the missing tail, which once mattered mostly as a vanished appendage, starts to matter as a structural compromise. This is one of the quiet revolutions in human evolution. When people imagine the rise of bipedalism, they often picture the most visible changes: first hands freed from locomotion, the head carried high, the horizon widening, the gait becoming efficient over distance. All of that is real. Habitual upright walking is one of the most consequential changes our lineage ever undergoes. It alters everything from energy use to social life to tool behavior. But it also demands a complete renegotiation of balance. A four-limbed mammal on the ground distributes weight across a long horizontal body. A biped must continuously prevent collapse forward, backward, or sideways while moving on a narrow base of support. This is not a simple posture. It is an active feat of control repeated with every step. The tail, had it still existed in a substantial form, might have served as one kind of counterbalance, as it does in many other animals. Yet humans do not enter bipedalism from that condition. We enter it as tailless apes. That means the entire burden of upright balance must be redistributed through other structures. The pelvis broadens and reorients. The femur angles inward toward the knee to bring the feet under the body's center of mass. The foot stiffens into a propulsive platform. The gluteal muscles are retasked into stabilizers that keep the pelvis level during walking. Most importantly, the spine itself develops curves that help position the torso above the hips. Those curves are ingenious. but they are not costless. They are one reason the human lower back is both remarkably capable and notoriously fragile. What survives in the fossil record suggests that this transition is gradual, uneven, and full of experiment. Early hominins do not instantly become modern human walkers. Their bodies preserve mixtures of traits, some suited to climbing, some to walking upright more often. In species such as Australopithecus, the pelvis, lower limb, and spinal column begin to show the unmistakable signs of committed bipedalism, yet the upper body still carries older arboreal capacities. Scholars still debate the precise locomotor repertoire of these ancestors, and the evidence remains incomplete, especially because complete spines are rare in the fossil record. But the general direction is clear enough. Our lineage spends millions of years learning how to be upright without ever recovering the tail its more distant ancestors once had. That matters because upright life is not merely walking while vertical. It is a whole-body balance problem solved through constant adjustment. The human trunk must remain poised over the pelvis. The head must be stabilized so vision stays useful while the body moves. The lower back must transfer force from the legs into the torso and back again. The pelvis must resist collapsing toward the unsupported side with each step. The knees and feet must absorb impact, store energy, and correct alignment. None of these functions belongs to a single bone or muscle. They are coordinated across the body. In a sense, the human answer to losing the tail is not to replace it with one new thing, but to distribute its old stabilizing role across many systems at once. This is why bipedalism is so often described as a package of trade-offs. It frees the hands, improves long-distance efficiency under certain conditions, changes thermoregulation in open environments, and may have supported new patterns of foraging and social behavior. But it also exposes the lower spine and pelvis to forces that few mammals experience in quite the same way. The lumbar region becomes especially important because it allows the upper body to align over the hips. In humans, the lower back develops a forward curve, lumbar lordosis, that helps position the center of mass correctly for upright stance. Without that curve, efficient bipedal posture becomes far harder. Yet the same curve also concentrates stress in ways that make strain, disc problems, and chronic pain common features of human life. This is where the hidden cost begins to sharpen. The tailless ape body can be modified for bipedality, but it is not rebuilt from scratch. Evolution does not pause to draft a cleanly optimized frame. It works by altering what already exists. So the human spine becomes a compromise between older ape anatomy and new upright demands. The pelvis must balance conflicting pressures as well. It needs to support bipedal motion efficiently. But in later humans, it must also permit the birth of large-brained infants. These twin demands do not align perfectly. They create one of the most famous tensions in human anatomy. And although the coccyx is only one small component of that region, it belongs to the same broader story. The rear end of the spine is no longer extended into a tail, yet it still has to anchor muscles and help define the geometry of a pelvis under immense evolutionary stress. A lesser-known detail is how much of upright balance happens not in obvious movement, but in tiny muscular corrections too subtle to notice. Humans standing still are never truly still. The body sways slightly. Muscles in the feet, calves, hips, back, and neck constantly refine posture. The nervous system integrates information from the inner ear, the eyes, and sensory receptors in joints and muscles to keep equilibrium from failing. A tail in another animal can contribute to such correction by shifting mass behind the body. Humans instead rely on an extraordinary layering of neuromuscular control. The loss of the tail is therefore not only compensated by changes in bone and muscle, but by greater dependence on coordination itself. Upright humanity is, in part, a triumph of controlled instability. That instability becomes more obvious when things go wrong. Lower back pain is among the most common human complaints across the world. The reasons are varied, involving age, injury, posture, work, inactivity, body weight, and many other factors. But underneath those immediate causes lies an evolutionary framework. The human lower back is asked to do difficult work in a body whose design is assembled from older parts. The evidence does not allow a simplistic claim that tail loss directly causes modern back pain in a one-to-one sense. No single explanation fully accounts for this, yet the broader connection is real. A lineage that shifted to upright walking after already losing its external tail had to reconfigure the base of the spine and the surrounding musculature in ways that left both strengths and vulnerabilities. There is a stark contrast here with other apes. Chimpanzees and gorillas can move bipedally for short distances, but their bodies are not organized for habitual upright walking in the human sense. Their spines, pelves, and lower limbs retain different relationships, and their center of mass is handled differently in locomotion. Humans push the ape template further than any other lineage does. We turn occasional upright posture into the foundation of daily life. That decision, made not consciously but through selection across vast time, amplifies every older anatomical compromise. The missing tail is one such compromise, inherited before the rise of humans proper and then forced into a new role by bipedality. The landscape may have helped drive this. As climates fluctuate in Africa and forests become patchier in some regions, early hominins may spend more time moving between wooded areas, exploiting mixed environments and using upright walking with increasing regularity. Scholars still debate exactly how environmental change relates to the origins of bipedalism, and simple stories about savanna life are no longer considered sufficient on their own. But what survives in the record suggests a world of ecological variability, not one uniform setting. In such a world, flexibility matters. A body able to walk efficiently on the ground while retaining some climbing capacity may hold an advantage. Over time, upright walking becomes not merely possible, but normal. And with normality comes deep anatomical commitment. The foramen magnum shifts under the skull, bringing the head into better alignment above the spine. The vertebral column becomes more S-shaped. The pelvis shortens and broadens. The femur and knee adopt a geometry suited to single-leg support during walking. The big toe aligns with the others rather than remaining strongly divergent for grasping. Each of these changes helps solve the problem of balance that a tail might once have helped manage in a different context. None solves it alone. Together they create a body that can walk for long distances, stand while carrying objects, and endure the demands of terrestrial life. But they also create a body whose lower back and pelvis are under chronic architectural pressure. There is something almost paradoxical in this. Upright walking is among the clearest marks of human success. It helps define our ecological reach, our endurance, and our later cultural possibilities. Yet it also turns the base of the spine into one of the most vulnerable zones in the body. The coccyx becomes less an isolated remnant than the terminal point of a whole evolutionary negotiation. It sits beneath a sacrum shaped by bipedality, beneath vertebrae whose curves must constantly juggle load and mobility, beneath a torso that no longer has a tail to assist with rearward balance. It is a tiny remnant inside a huge redesign. The ancient mutation that helped remove the tail does not by itself make humans upright. The later rise of bipedality does not by itself explain every modern spinal problem. But when the two histories meet, the result is unmistakable. A tailless ape body learns to stand and walk habitually on two legs, and in doing so, it creates one of the most distinctive and burdened anatomies in the mammalian world. We gain reach, endurance, free hands, and a new relationship to landscape. We also inherit strain. By the time later human ancestors are fully committed bipeds, the old tail has been gone for millions of years. What remains is not regret, exactly, but evidence. The body has solved the ancient problem of balance in a new way, with curved spine, reshaped pelvis, powerful gluteal muscles, and constant neurological control. It works well enough to carry our species across continents. It works well enough to build history. But the hidden cost never quite disappears. It waits in the lower back. In childbirth, in muscular fatigue, in the uneasy brilliance of a body always one bad fall away from reminding itself how difficult it is to stand upright without the things its ancestors once carried behind them. What the human body finally settles into is not a clean absence, but a residue. The tail does not simply vanish and leave nothing behind. Instead, it is reduced, folded inward, and fixed into a small structure that most people rarely think about until something goes wrong. At the very end of the spine sits the coccyx, a cluster of fused vertebrae that once would have extended outward as a mobile appendage. Now it remains embedded within the body, quiet and unassuming, yet still carrying the memory of a very different form. It is easy to dismiss the coccyx as vestigial, a word that often implies uselessness, but that is only partially true. The coccyx is diminished, yes, but it is not meaningless. It serves as an anchor point for muscles, tendons, and ligaments, particularly those that form part of the pelvic floor. These structures support the organs of the lower abdomen, help maintain continence, and contribute to stability during sitting and movement. In that sense, the coccyx is not a dead relic. It is a repurposed one. Evolution rarely wastes material. Even reduced structures are often woven back into the body's functional network. Yet its presence still feels like a compromise. The coccyx is small, but it occupies a critical position. It sits beneath the sacrum at the base of a spine that has already been reshaped for upright posture. It is part of a region that must bear pressure during sitting, absorb minor impacts, and serve as a structural endpoint for forces travelling down the vertebral column. Unlike a tail, which could move, flex, and distribute force along its length, the coccyx is fixed. It does not swing or adjust dynamically. It simply receives what comes to it. This limitation becomes apparent in everyday experience. A fall onto the lower back can bruise the coccyx in a way that is disproportionately painful. Sitting for long periods can create discomfort in that region. Inflammation, known as coccydynia, can develop and persist, sometimes without a clear single cause. These are not catastrophic failures, but they are reminders that the base of the human spine is not an elegantly over-engineered solution. It is a workable endpoint shaped by history. There is also variation. Not all coccyxes are identical. Some are more curved, some more straight, some are fused into a single unit, others retain slight segmentation. These differences can influence how pressure is distributed when sitting, or how the surrounding tissues respond to strain. In certain individuals, the coccyx angles in ways that make it more susceptible to discomfort. In others, it remains relatively unnoticed throughout life. What survives in the record suggests that this variability is part of the broader pattern of human anatomy, functional, but not standardized to perfection. One of the more surprising aspects of the coccyx is how often it becomes relevant during childbirth. The human pelvis is already under significant evolutionary tension. balancing the demands of upright walking with the need to pass a large-brained infant through the birth canal. During labour, the coccyx can move slightly backward, increasing the available space for delivery. This small movement may seem trivial, but it can make a meaningful difference in a process already constrained by anatomy. At the same time, this flexibility introduces risk. The coccyx can be injured during childbirth, leading to pain that may persist long after the event itself. This dual role, helpful yet vulnerable, captures something essential about the structure. The coccyx is not a leftover in the sense of being irrelevant. It is a leftover that has been integrated into a new system, one that depends on it in subtle ways while also exposing it to new forms of stress. No single explanation fully accounts for its current condition. It is both a remnant of a tail and a component of a pelvic system shaped by bipedal life. There is also a deeper anatomical context to consider. The coccyx does not exist in isolation. It is part of a continuum that includes the lumbar vertebrae above and the sacrum just above it. The sacrum itself is a fusion of vertebrae that connects the spine to the pelvis, forming a rigid base for transmitting forces between the upper body and the legs. Together, this sacrum and coccyx form the terminal region of the vertebral column. This region must handle compression, tension, and subtle shifts in alignment as the body moves and rests. In animals with tails, the forces acting on the base of the spine can be distributed along the length of the tail. Movement, flexibility, and muscular control allow energy to dissipate and adjust dynamically. In humans, that option is gone. The energy has nowhere to travel beyond the coccyx. It must be absorbed or redirected through the surrounding tissues. Over time, this can contribute to wear, strain, and sensitivity in ways that are not immediately obvious, but become familiar with age or repeated stress. Another lesser-known detail is how the coccyx interacts with posture. When a person sits, particularly on hard surfaces, the angle of the pelvis determines how much weight is transferred to the coccyx. A more upright posture tends to shift weight toward the ischial tuberosities, the sitting bones, while a slouched posture can increase pressure on the coccyx. This is why certain sitting positions feel uncomfortable over time, and why posture advice often emphasizes alignment rather than simply relaxation. The body is constantly negotiating how to distribute force across structures that were not originally designed for prolonged sitting in modern contexts. There is a quiet irony here. Humans spend large portions of their lives sitting, yet the anatomy of the lower spine and coccyx evolved in a context where sitting for extended periods on flat surfaces was not a primary activity. Early humans likely alternated between walking, squatting, resting, and brief seated positions that did not place continuous pressure on the coccyx. Modern habits introduce new patterns of stress that interact with an already compromised structure. The coccyx becomes not only a relic of the past, but a participant in the challenges of the present. Medical intervention sometimes reflects this complexity. In severe cases of chronic coccyx pain, surgical removal, coccygectomy, may be considered. That such a procedure is possible without catastrophic consequences highlights the limited essential function of the coccyx in isolation. Yet the fact that it can become a source of significant discomfort underscores that even reduced structures can matter deeply in lived experience. The body can function without it, but it does not always function comfortably with it. Scholars are careful not to overstate the coccyx as the singular cause of human spinal problems. The lower back, pelvis, muscles, and nervous system all contribute to the overall picture, but the coccyx remains a focal point because it embodies the layered nature of human anatomy. It is at once ancient and modern, functional and vestigial, necessary and problematic. It is a structure that makes sense only when viewed through the lens of deep time. What survives in the record suggests that tail loss did not erase the past so much as compress it. The coccyx is a compressed tail, a condensed history at the end of the spine. It carries forward the idea of a tail without the form. It anchors new functions while hinting at old ones. It is a reminder that evolution does not cleanly remove what it no longer needs. It modifies, reduces, and reassigns, leaving behind structures that are neither fully obsolete nor fully optimized. In this way, the coccyx becomes more than an anatomical detail. It becomes a symbol of the broader evolutionary process. It shows how the body adapts by working with what is already there, even when that material was designed for a different purpose. It shows how new solutions are built on old foundations, and how those foundations can shape the limits of what comes next. And as the story continues, the coccyx is not the only place where the past resurfaces. The embryo, the rare reappearance of tail-like structures, and the genetic mechanisms that still carry the instructions for tail formation all point to a deeper continuity. The human body is not a clean break from its ancestry. It is a layered construction, with each layer influencing the next. The tail may be gone from sight, but it has not disappeared from the story. It remains at the base of the spine, in the way the body balances, in the way it bears weight, and in the quiet discomfort that sometimes reminds us of how much has changed and how much has not. Before birth, before language, before posture, before the first breath enters the lungs, the human body briefly returns to an older world in the protected darkness of embryonic development, long before it resembles the finished outline people recognize as human. It follows instructions inherited from ancestors so distant they belong less to memory than to the deep grammar of vertebrate life. The body axis extends. Somites form in sequence like measured repetitions. Limbs bud outward. The head enlarges, and for a short, astonishing interval, the embryo grows a tail. This is not poetic exaggeration. In the early stages of development, the human embryo possesses a distinct tail-like projection, extending beyond what will become the lower limbs. It contains vertebral elements in formation and reflects a developmental pattern shared across tailed vertebrates. Later, as growth continues, that projection is reduced, cells are reorganized, tissue is resorbed, and the external tail no longer remains. By the time the body approaches birth, what persists is the coccyx and the surrounding anatomy of the lower spine. But the sequence matters. The human form does not begin as fully tailless. It becomes tailless through a process of reduction. What survives in the record suggests that this is one of the clearest windows into our ancestry that the body still offers. Fossils can be broken, genes can be difficult to interpret in isolation, but embryonic development shows, in living form, that the ancient body plan has not been erased. It has been edited. The embryo passes through a stage in which a tail is not an abstract evolutionary idea, but a real anatomical feature, however temporary. The body briefly remembers something the adult body no longer displays. There is something unsettling and revealing in that memory. Evolution is often imagined as a sequence of completed transformations, with each new stage fully replacing the old. Embryology makes that story harder to sustain. The old is not always removed. Sometimes it is produced and then suppressed. Sometimes it appears only to be folded back into a newer arrangement. The human tail belongs to this category. It is not absent from the beginning. It is present and then taken away. That pattern explains why rare medical cases can be so striking. On uncommon occasions, babies are born with tail-like appendages. These cases have fascinated physicians for generations, partly because they appear to collapse the distance between modern humans and their ancient ancestry. But scholars and clinicians are careful here, because not every so-called human tail is the same thing. Some are pseudo-tails, protrusions caused by underlying developmental anomalies, fatty tissue, elongated coccygeal structures, or spinal defects rather than a direct expression of a true ancestral tail. Others are closer to what physicians describe as vestigial tails, soft, tail-like appendages aligned with the embryonic developmental pathway, sometimes capable of slight movement, though lacking the full muscular and skeletal complexity of a functional animal tail. The distinction matters because sensational stories tend to flatten everything into the same myth. They turn rare medical phenomena into theatrical proof that evolution occasionally runs backward. That is not how development works. These cases are not reversals of evolution in any meaningful sense. They are variations, disruptions, or partial re-expressions within a developmental system that still carries old instructions. The human body is not suddenly becoming a monkey again. It is revealing that the line between present structure and ancestral potential is thinner than it appears. This is one reason embryology remains so powerful. It exposes ancestry not as a sequence of museum exhibits, but as a living constraint on how bodies are built. The embryo does not have unlimited freedom. It must work through inherited pathways, and those pathways come from ancient vertebrate design. The tail appears because the body still knows how to build one. It disappears because later developmental processes now override that earlier outcome. The finished human form depends on both stages. First the ancient construction, then the modern reduction. Scholars still debate how far one should push this insight. Older biology once leaned too heavily on the notion that embryonic development straightforwardly repeats evolutionary history. That claim, in its classic form, is too simple and often misleading. Embryos do not reenact the entire adult history of their ancestors step by step. Development is not a miniature documentary of evolution, yet it does preserve traces, and the tail is one of the more vivid ones. The evidence remains incomplete if one tries to treat embryology as a perfect archive of the past, but it remains deeply informative if treated more carefully. The embryo does not replay everything. It does reveal what the body still builds before it revises itself. That revision is not always flawless. In some cases, problems in the lower spine and surrounding tissues accompany tail-like protrusions or other developmental anomalies. Neural tube defects, spinal dystrophism, tethered cord syndrome, and related conditions can intersect with unusual development in the tail region. Again, no single explanation fully accounts for every case, and medicine is cautious for good reason. But these rare events show how delicate the developmental editing process really is. A small disruption in timing or tissue patterning can expose ancient structures or produce modern complications. The human body reaches its familiar form through successful coordination, not inevitability. There is also a powerful emotional dimension to these cases, even if science must keep its tone measured. Parents confronted with a newborn bearing a tail-like appendage often face not only a medical issue but a symbolic one. The image is startling because it seems to bring deep time too close to the present. It reveals, with unusual clarity, that the human body is not sealed off from its past. Beneath the polished language of anatomy and genetics lies a simpler fact. The blueprint still remembers more than the adult body shows. The embryo itself demonstrates that this memory is ordinary, not exceptional. Every human being begins with that temporary echo. Every one of us passes through a stage in which the body forms more vertebrae than it will ultimately display externally. The later reduction feels so automatic that it disappears from common awareness, but it is one of the most dramatic examples of how evolution leaves behind processes rather than just structures. The tail is not merely encoded as a lost feature. It is encoded as a feature that still begins to happen. That phrase matters because it shifts the mystery from form to timing. Why does the body still start building a tail at all? The answer lies partly in developmental economy. Evolution modifies existing programs more readily than it invents entirely new ones from nothing. If the old body axis machinery is still effective for organizing the embryo, selection may preserve much of it while changing only the later steps that reduce the tail. This is often how evolution works, not by rewriting the whole script, but by changing the ending. The human embryo can still use an ancient framework because that framework remains useful for building the broader body plan, even if one part of its original outcome is no longer desired. This also helps explain why vestiges remain elsewhere in anatomy. The body is full of structures repurposed rather than reinvented. The ear bones come from older jaw elements. The appendix may be reduced relative to some ancestral conditions, but still retains immune roles. Muscles appear whose original significance shifts over time. The coccyx belongs to this same category of layered inheritance. It is not a failure of evolution to clean up after itself. It is evidence that evolution builds with continuity. It keeps old scaffolding where possible, then reshapes it. A lesser-known detail is that embryos of many vertebrates share striking similarities early in development, especially in the organization of the body axis, pharyngeal arches, and tail region. Those similarities later diverge dramatically as species-specific traits emerge. The human embryo's temporary tail is part of that shared vertebrate heritage. It reminds us that human uniqueness arrives relatively late in developmental terms. We begin from common ground and only gradually become the highly specialized primates we think of as ourselves. That realization softens the boundary between the ancient and the modern. The tail is not confined to vanished apes or fossil primates. It exists as a transient condition in the beginning of every human life. It belongs to the hidden hours before memory, when the body is still deciding what kind of vertebrate it will finally appear to be, and in rare moments when that decision unfolds differently, the result can bring the old pattern into plain sight. By now, the story of tail loss no longer looks like a single event. It is a chain of connected realities. The ape lineage loses the external tail. The embryo retains a temporary version of it. The adult body compresses what remains into the coccyx. Rare births reveal that the ancient pathway has not been fully erased. The evidence points in one direction again and again. Our form is cumulative. It does not sever itself from the past. It carries the past in suppressed stages, hidden instructions, and vulnerable seams, and that makes the next part of the story more difficult to ignore. If the body still remembers how to build a tail, and if the lower spine still carries the structural remnant of one, then the consequences of tail loss are not merely theoretical. They belong to the real design of human life. They appear in posture, in childbirth, in injury, in chronic pain, and in the simple fact that a body built from ancient compromises must keep paying for them. The tail may survive only as an echo, but the cost of losing it is no echo at all. It is lived. The cost does not announce itself dramatically in daily life. It arrives as stiffness after sitting too long, as a lower back that tightens without warning, as a pelvis that carries more strain than it seems built for, as childbirth that remains difficult and dangerous even under modern medicine, as falls that leave a sharp bruise deep at the base of the spine, as ordinary pain so common it is easy to forget how strange it really is. For a species that prides itself on intelligence, adaptability, and control over the environment, the human body remains oddly vulnerable in the very places most shaped by its evolutionary success. The hidden cost of losing the tail is not that we miss having something to wave behind us. It is that the body must solve, again and again, the balancing and structural problems a tail once helped many vertebrates handle differently. This cost begins with the lower back. In a human being, the lumbar spine bears an enormous burden. It supports the upper body, transmits force during walking and lifting, helps maintain the curves necessary for upright balance, and absorbs the accumulated pressures of age, posture, and motion. This region must be flexible enough to move, yet stable enough not to collapse. It must support the trunk above a pelvis already reshaped for bipedalism and childbirth. It does all this without the long posterior extension that, in many other animals, serves as a dynamic stabilizer or counterweight. Scholars still debate how directly tail loss contributes to particular disorders, because no single explanation fully accounts for every form of back pain. But the broader evolutionary framework is difficult to dismiss. A tailless upright primate is asking its lower spine to perform an unusually difficult task. That task becomes more obvious when one compares humans with other mammals. A dog or cat distributes weight through a largely horizontal spine supported by 4 limbs. A monkey moving on all 4s still carries its center of mass differently, with the tail often participating in balance and posture. A kangaroo uses its tail as part of its locomotor system in ways so integral that it can function almost as a 5th limb during slow movement. Humans stand with the trunk stacked above the pelvis, the head balanced atop the column, and the body's weight repeatedly caught and redirected through alternating steps. The human solution is elegant in motion, but elegance is not the same as safety. The design works, yet it works under tension. The pelvis reveals the tension especially well. It is one of the most consequential bones in the human story because it sits at the intersection of movement, support, and reproduction. In our lineage, the pelvis must become efficient enough for upright walking while still preserving a birth canal large enough for infants with increasingly large heads. These demands do not align neatly. The result is a structure shaped by compromise. The female pelvis, in particular, reflects one of the clearest examples of evolutionary trade-off. It must support bipedal locomotion and allow childbirth under conditions that remain difficult even after millions of years of selection. The coccyx, small though it is, belongs to this region and participates in its compromises. During labor, it can move slightly backward to increase space, yet it can also be injured or left painful afterward. The hidden cost of tail loss therefore overlaps with one of the deepest biological costs of being human at all. This is where the story moves beyond abstract anatomy and into lived experience. Human childbirth is unusually demanding among mammals. It is not uniquely dangerous in every respect, and modern medical care changes the outcome profoundly. But the underlying anatomical difficulty remains striking. The newborn head and shoulders must pass through a pelvis already constrained by upright posture. Labor is not simply an event the body glides through. It is a contest between shape and space. Scholars still debate exactly how much of this tension should be attributed to brain size, pelvic mechanics, metabolic limits, and other factors, but the evidence remains incomplete only in detail, not in principle. Human reproduction is hard because the body is balancing incompatible evolutionary pressures at once. Tail loss alone did not create that dilemma, but it forms part of the deeper reorganization of the lower trunk and pelvis that makes the dilemma possible. There is another, quieter cost in the pelvic floor. This network of muscles and connective tissues supports the bladder, bowel, and reproductive organs. In a horizontal-bodied quadruped, these structures are suspended under different gravitational logic. In an upright human, the pelvic floor must resist the chronic downward pull of organs and abdominal pressure. Pregnancy, childbirth, aging, chronic strain, and simple gravity all act on it over time. The coccyx serves as one of the anchor points for this system. Again, the issue is not that the absence of a tail single-handedly causes pelvic floor disorders. It is that the human reconfiguration of the lower body, built upon a tailless ape inheritance and intensified by bipedalism, leaves this entire region operating close to its structural margins. Prolapse, incontinence, chronic pelvic pain, and related conditions are part of that margin. One lesser-known detail is how much human sitting behavior exposes this evolutionary compromise. We're not merely upright walkers, we're also, in modern life, habitual sitters. The body did not evolve for hours of chair-bound stillness on flat surfaces. When seated, especially with poor posture, pressure can shift toward the coccyx and sacral region. The lower back may lose its optimal curvature, discs may experience altered loading, and the muscles that normally stabilize the trunk may become fatigued or underused. Over years, the cumulative effect can feel like a problem of modern lifestyle alone. In one sense it is, but lifestyle interacts with anatomy already shaped by older vulnerabilities. The body's not failing from nowhere. It is being asked to live in ways that expose the compromises it always carried. There is also the matter of injury, a fall on ice, a bicycle accident, a hard landing on a stair, a collision in sport. Events like these often produce pain in the sacrum, coccyx, or lumbar region that can linger far longer than expected. The area feels strangely fragile because the end of the spine is not protected by a large muscular tail or a broader distribution of posterior structures. The coccyx sits in a position where impact can translate into inflammation, bruising, or instability. Meanwhile, the lower lumbar discs above are vulnerable to compression, torsion, and degeneration. What seems like a simple strain may reflect the cumulative sensitivity of a region carrying millions of years of architectural compromise. Modern medicine sees the consequences constantly. Lower back pain is one of the most widespread causes of disability on Earth. Tailbone pain, while less common, can be unexpectedly stubborn. Sciatica radiates from irritated nerves rooted in the lower spine. Herniated discs can turn a minor movement into weeks or months of dysfunction. Pelvic floor disorders affect large numbers of people, especially after childbirth or with advancing age. None of these conditions can be reduced to a single ancient mutation or one lost appendage. That would be false and far too neat. But taken together, they form a pattern. The lower human trunk is both remarkably capable and unusually burdened. It is a region where evolution achieves something transformative without ever achieving comfort. That discomfort is not just physical. It also reveals how misleading the idea of evolutionary perfection can be. People often imagine natural selection as a process that steadily improves design. The human body, especially in its most iconic features, is often discussed in tones of admiration: the hand, the eye, the brain, the upright gait. Yet the cost of these traits is written all through us. Natural selection does not optimize for lifelong ease. It filters for reproductive success under particular conditions. If a body can survive, reproduce, and pass on its traits, it may carry extensive flaws that only become obvious later, or under unusual circumstances, or in environments unlike those in which it evolved. The hidden cost of tail loss belongs to that harsh logic. The body did not need to be painless, it only needed to work well enough. And it did work astonishingly well. A tailless upright primate crosses open ground, carries food, transports infants, manipulates tools, endures heat over distance, and eventually alters the planet. The gains are immense. That is why the costs remain hidden so easily. Success conceals the strain that underlies it. We do not think of walking as a balancing act conducted by an unstable column of vertebrae, because walking feels effortless once learned. We do not think of childbirth as an evolutionary bottleneck in anatomical form, because it is embedded in social and medical systems that change how it is experienced. We do not think of the coccyx as a compressed tail, because it is so small and so out of sight. But the hidden cost is there in all of it, in the effort the body must expend to stay upright, in the narrow tolerances of the pelvis, in the frequency with which the lower back complains. There is even an emotional strangeness in this realization. The very traits most associated with being human upright stance, free hands, transformed pelvis, reorganized spine are not signs that we escaped our animal past. They are signs that we remained trapped within it, forced to innovate through compromise. Losing the tail did not liberate us into a cleaner design. It bound us more tightly to a difficult one. The price is paid not once, but daily, in minute acts of posture and balance, in invisible muscular work in old age, in recovery, in labour, in injury. What survives in the record suggests that the body never entirely solved the old problem of balance and support. It redistributed it. The tail's former contributions were broken apart and handed off to the lumbar curve, the pelvis, the gluteal muscles, the pelvic floor, the inner ear, and the neural systems coordinating posture. That distribution made human life possible. It also meant there would be no single point of failure and no single point of ease. The whole lower body became the solution, and therefore the whole lower body inherited the burden. So the hidden cost of tail loss is not one symptom or one bone. It is an entire zone of human vulnerability. It is the price paid for a body that carries itself differently from almost every other mammal. It is the quiet instability beneath our most ordinary movements. And once that becomes clear, another question follows naturally. If the human body no longer has the tail, if it instead balances through an elaborate mesh of spine, muscle, posture, and brain, then why did evolution commit so fully to this difficult arrangement at all? Why let the old appendage go if the replacement is so costly? The answer is not simple, and scholars still debate it, because tail loss may never have had one cause. It may have emerged from several overlapping changes at once. That is the part of the story where certainty begins to thin out. Bones can show what changed. Embryos can show what still flickers beneath the finished form. Genes can hint at the mechanisms that altered the body plan. But when it comes to the deeper question why the tail disappeared in the first place, the evidence becomes more difficult to line up into one clean answer. Scholars still debate the issue because the tail almost certainly does not vanish for one reason alone. It disappears inside a broader transformation of the ape body, and broader transformations rarely submit to simple causes. The old appendage may have become less useful, more costly, developmentally vulnerable, behaviourally irrelevant, or all of these at once. No single explanation fully accounts for this ancient loss. One explanation begins with locomotion. This is the most intuitive theory and, in many ways, the most persuasive at first glance. As the ancestors of apes shift away from monkey-like quadrupedal movement along the tops of branches and toward more vertical climbing, cautious clambering, suspension, and eventually other specialized forms of arboreal motion, the tail may simply become less valuable, in a monkey body. The tail functions as a balancing rod integrated into a narrow trunk and a style of movement that depends on rapid adjustment along unstable supports. In an ape body, the torso broadens, the shoulder becomes more mobile, and the limbs take on a larger share of balance and control. If the body's already changing in ways that reduce reliance on the tail, then selection may no longer maintain it so strongly. That explanation fits much of the anatomical evidence, but it does not close the case. The trouble is that less useful is not the same as selected against. Evolution does not automatically remove every structure whose role diminishes. Many features linger for long periods if they are not costly enough to matter. So a locomotor explanation may describe part of the context without fully explaining why the external tail disappears so thoroughly across the ape lineage. Something more may be happening in development, or selection may have favoured a more integrated trunk strongly enough that the tail became a hindrance rather than just an irrelevance. Another explanation emphasises body plan and trunk mechanics. Apes are not merely tailless. They're built around a different kind of torso, their chests are broader, their lower backs are relatively shorter, their shoulders are positioned for a greater range of motion, their whole axial skeleton behaves differently. In that view, tail loss is less an isolated adaptation than a side effect, or perhaps a necessary correlate of reorganizing the spine and pelvis into a new configuration. The tail may disappear because the rear of the body is being redesigned as part of a more compact, flexible, upper body dominant form of arboreal movement. This explanation has the advantage of treating the missing tail as one feature within a package rather than as an independent trait. What survives in the record suggests that this may be closer to the truth than any theory treating the tail as if it were removed by itself. Then there is the developmental explanation, which has gained force from genetics. If changes in regulatory elements affecting genes such as TBXT altered how the tail region forms during embryonic growth, the visible loss of the tail may have originated in a mutation with relatively broad developmental effects. In that case, selection may not have been acting directly on the tail alone. It may have favoured a mutation because, on balance, it fit or enabled a successful ape body plan, even if it carried side effects or developmental risks. This possibility is appealing because it connects anatomy to a mechanism. It explains how a large visible difference can emerge from a small alteration in developmental timing or gene regulation. But it still leaves open the question of why such a mutation would spread. A developmental change can occur, certainly, but for it to define an entire lineage, it must be tolerated or favoured within a broader ecological and anatomical context. Some researchers have also considered social or signalling explanations, though these tend to be more speculative. Tails in many mammals and monkeys serve communicative roles. If apes increasingly rely on facial expression, vocalization, posture, and complex upper body gesture, the tail's communicative function may have declined. That could make it easier for the structure to be lost once other selective pressures were already reducing its mechanical value. But as a primary explanation, this tends to feel insufficient. Tails can be useful for communication without imposing heavy costs, and many highly social animals keep them. Still, as a secondary factor, it is not unreasonable. Evolution often proceeds through the weakening of multiple small advantages rather than the collapse of one big one. There is also the question of size. Early apes may have been, on average, larger bodied than many monkey ancestors. Larger bodies moving through trees face different mechanical challenges. They cannot rely as easily on the same quick balancing strategies used by smaller primates darting across slender branches. Instead, they often shift toward cautious climbing, weight distribution through the limbs, and more deliberate movement in such a context. The tail may contribute less to stability than it once did. A larger trunk, more powerful shoulder girdle, and grasping hands and feet may become the dominant tools of arboreal life. This does not mean body size alone causes tail loss, but it may be part of the environment in which tail loss becomes acceptable. The most convincing view may be the least dramatic one: the tail disappears because several forces align. Locomotion changes, trunk architecture changes, body size changes, development changes, communication changes. None of these alone needs to be sufficient if together they reduce the tail's importance enough, or alter the body plan enough. That selection no longer preserves it. Scholars still debate the relative weight of each factor because the fossil record is incomplete and soft tissues are mostly lost to time. But the pattern itself, multiple overlapping explanations rather than one universal answer, fits what evolution so often looks like in practice. There is a useful caution here. People are drawn to single-cause stories because they feel satisfying. One mutation did it. One environmental shift did it. One new behavior made the tail unnecessary. But bodies do not usually change that way, especially not in deep evolutionary time. A trait as conspicuous as a tail is connected to muscle, balance, development, signaling, and the geometry of the whole body. Losing it likely required a convergence of conditions rather than a lone trigger. The evidence remains incomplete, but incompleteness is not failure. It is often the honor shape of ancient history, and yet some possibilities can still be ruled out, or at least treated with skepticism. The tail was not lost because evolution was trying to make humans or apes more advanced. That kind of language misleads more than it explains. Tails remain excellent structures in many successful lineages. Monkeys did not fail by keeping them. Apes did not triumph by losing them. These are different solutions, not higher and lower states. Likewise, unsupported popular theories sometimes imagine the tail as a useless leftover abruptly discarded once primates became smarter or more civilized. That reverses the logic of the evidence. The loss happens long before humanity and long before anything like civilization. It belongs to ancient ape anatomy, not to some late burst of refinement. One lesser-known complication is that tail loss may not have been entirely beneficial even in the beginning. Evolution can fix traits that come with costs if those costs are offset by enough advantages elsewhere, or if they arise after reproduction. This matters because the same developmental mechanisms suspected in tail reduction may also raise the risk of defect when they go wrong. If so, tail loss could be one more example of a trait that spreads not because it is flawless, but because its benefits or its compatibility with a new body plan outweigh the risks often enough. Nature is full of such bargains. Sickle cell trait persists because of malaria. Large brains persist despite childbirth difficulty. Upright walking persists despite bad backs. Tail loss may belong to that same uneasy category. The human temptation is to ask which explanation is correct, singular, final, and complete. The more evolutionary answer is that the right question may be how much each explanation contributes. Did the tail first become less useful in locomotion, making developmental reduction easier to tolerate? Or did a developmental change arise first, with the evolving ape body then accommodating and exploiting the new condition? Did trunk reorganization and tail loss reinforce one another in a feedback loop? These are harder questions, but probably closer to the truth. This uncertainty is not a weakness in the story. It is part of what makes it compelling. The missing human tail is not explained by one dramatic revelation, but by intersecting lines of evidence, comparative anatomy, embryology, genetics, fossils, and biomechanics, each illuminating part of the problem and leaving part in shadow. What survives in the record suggests a body being reassembled around a new set of priorities, even if those priorities never align perfectly enough for modern observers to point to one master cause. And perhaps that is fitting, because the consequences were never singular either. Losing the tail did not just change one's silhouette, it altered the balance of the trunk, the structure of the spine, the function of the pelvis, the nature of locomotion, the risks of development, and eventually the vulnerabilities of the human lower back. A multi-causal change produced multi-layered consequences. The body did not simplify. It became differently complicated. So the question is no longer only why the tail vanished. It is how the tailless body kept functioning so well after it did, how a primate, without that old stabilizing appendage, managed to balance, climb, walk, and eventually stand fully upright with such strange success. The answer lies not in one missing structure, but in everything else that rose to compensate. Muscles, nerves, inner ear, feet, spine, and brain all had to take on work once distributed differently. The tail was gone. But balance itself was not. It had to be rewritten. Once the tail is gone, balance does not become less important. It becomes harder. The body still has to know where it is in space. It still has to prevent a fall when weight shifts unexpectedly, when the ground changes underfoot, when the head turns quickly, when one leg leaves the ground and the whole trunk has to be caught over the other. In many animals, part of that control can be assisted by a tail acting as a movable counterweight, a stabilizer, a fast correction behind the center of mass. Humans inherit no such option. The old appendage is gone, yet the need it once helped address remains, so the task is passed elsewhere. It is spread across the feet, the hips, the spine, the inner ear, and above all the nervous system, which must coordinate these parts constantly if the body is to remain upright at all. This is one of the quiet marvels of human movement. Walking looks simple because the brain and body hide most of the work. A person rises, takes a step, turns, stops, bends, and straightens again with so little conscious effort that it is easy to imagine balance as some passive property of standing. In reality, balance is an active negotiation running every second. The human body is never truly still. Even while standing in place, it sways almost imperceptibly, making tiny corrections through ankle muscles, hip muscles, spinal stabilizers, and the subtle shifting of pressure beneath the feet. The absence of a tail does not leave a gap in this process so much as force the entire system to become more distributed and more precise. The feet are the first part of this new arrangement. In many primates, the foot remains partly a grasping structure, useful for climbing and holding branches. In humans, the foot becomes something else, a platform, a spring, a sensor, and a propulsive lever all at once. Its arches store and release energy. Its broad heel receives impact. Its aligned big toe helps drive the body forward. Beneath all of that, the sole of the foot delivers a constant stream of information about pressure, tilt, and contact with the ground. This sensory information is essential. A body without a tail cannot rely on rearward mass shifts to correct itself quickly in the same way many other animals can. Instead, it learns the ground through the feet and adjusts from below upward. Above the feet, the legs and hips inherit another part of the burden. One of the most important balances in human walking occurs not at the level of the spine, but at the pelvis. Every time one foot lifts from the ground, the body enters a moment of controlled imbalance. For an instant, The full weight of the trunk is supported on one leg. If the pelvis drops too far toward the unsupported side, the motion becomes unstable and inefficient. To prevent that, the gluteal muscles, especially gluteus medius and gluteus minimus, work as lateral stabilizers, holding the pelvis level and controlling sway. This is a profoundly important shift in function. In many quadrupeds, the gluteal region plays different roles shaped by different mechanical needs. In humans, these muscles become guardians of upright equilibrium. This is one reason the buttocks are so distinctive in the human body. Their form is not only about size or fat distribution, it reflects deeper functional demands. The gluteus maximus contributes powerfully during running, climbing, and rising, while the lateral gluteal muscles help stabilize the pelvis during ordinary walking. The body has, in effect, reassigned some of the work that a tail might once have supported into a muscular system tied directly to bipedal control. The rear of the body still governs balance, but now it does so through hips and muscle rather than a mobile appendage. The spine, too, becomes part of this rewritten balance system. Its curves are not decorative. They are solutions to a very difficult engineering problem: how to keep the torso above the pelvis while allowing movement, shock absorption, and flexibility. The lumbar curve helps position the center of mass over the hips. The thoracic and cervical curves interact with it to distribute load through the trunk and keep the head stable enough for vision. Without these curves, the upright body would either tip or require far greater muscular effort simply to remain erect. Yet the same spinal design introduces new fragilities, because a column that curves under load can absorb stress, but it can also concentrate it. The spine solves balance and creates risk in the same act. Then there is the inner ear, a small and easily overlooked structure that contributes enormously to the life of a tailless upright animal. Within it, the vestibular system detects angular and linear acceleration, helping the brain track the movement of the head in space. This information is integrated with visual cues and sensory feedback from muscles and joints to maintain orientation. If the vestibular system is disturbed, balance deteriorates quickly. The world seems to spin or tilt. Standing becomes effortful. Walking becomes uncertain. The importance of this system reveals something basic. Human balance is less about any one external structure and more about a complex network of sensory prediction and muscular response. We do not have a tail to correct us from behind. We have perception and coordination doing that work internally. Vision is part of the same machinery. Human beings are intensely visual animals, and sight contributes significantly to postural control. The horizon, nearby edges, motion in peripheral vision, the movement of one's own body relative to the environment, all of this feeds into balance. That is why walking in the dark feels different, why dizziness is worse with closed eyes, and why uneven or moving surfaces can be so destabilizing. The body does not balance by one mechanism only. It balances by combining systems that cross-check one another. Feet report the ground, joints report angle and strain, the inner ear reports motion, the eyes report orientation, the brain turns these streams into action. There is a revealing irony in this arrangement. The tail, in many animals, is an external mechanical aid. Human balance relies far more heavily on internal integration. It is as if the body solved the problem of losing an appendage by becoming more aware of itself. That solution is powerful, but it is also metabolically and neurologically demanding. Controlled upright motion requires prediction, timing, and constant refinement. When these systems mature in childhood, balance improves dramatically. When they degrade in old age, falls become more common. The cost of rewriting balance is that balance must now be actively maintained through a network vulnerable to fatigue, injury, age, and disease. Scholars still debate how much of this reorganization should be thought of as compensation specifically for tail loss, and how much should simply be understood as part of the broader rise of bipedalism. The distinction matters because human evolution did not begin from a long-tailed monkey body poised to stand up tomorrow. It began from a tailless ape inheritance already committed to other forms of balance. No single explanation fully accounts for how much each component replaced what the tail once did. Some functions are not directly comparable. A tail in a monkey, a tail in a cheetah, and a human vestibular spinal hip system are solving related but not identical problems. Still, the comparison remains illuminating. When the tail disappears, the body does not cease balancing. It redistributes balance across many systems and then refines those systems with extraordinary intensity. One lesser-known detail is how much balance depends on anticipation rather than reaction. Before the foot lands, the body's already preparing the trunk. Before the head turns, muscles in the neck and torso are already coordinating with vestibular input. Before a person lifts one arm or shifts one leg, postural muscles often fire in advance to keep the body from being thrown off center. This anticipatory control is one of the hidden achievements of the human motor system. It allows a tailless biped not merely to recover from instability, but to plan for it. The body predicts imbalance and meets it early. In evolutionary terms, this is a profound alternative to mechanical correction by appendage. It also shows why neurological disorders can be so devastating to human movement. Damage to the cerebellum, inner ear, spinal cord, peripheral nerves, or even small sensory pathways can make standing and walking suddenly difficult. The system has little redundancy in the old mechanical sense. It is elegant but distributed, and because it is distributed, failure in one part can destabilize the whole. A tail might have offered one kind of robust physical backup in certain animals. Humans instead depend on a refined orchestration that works brilliantly until one instrument falls out of time. That orchestration extends even into seemingly simple acts like turning around. When a person pivots quickly, the center of mass shifts, the trunk twists, the head leads, the eyes stabilize the visual field, the feet reposition, and the hips absorb rotational forces. There is no tail sweeping behind to counter-turn the body. The correction happens through muscular timing and sensory control. We carry our balance not as an appendage, but as a pattern of coordination. What survives in the record suggests that this rewriting of balance was one of the great hidden projects of human evolution. The visible marks are obvious enough: arched feet, reoriented pelvis, spinal curves, enlarged gluteal muscles, altered gait. But beneath them lies something harder to fossilize and no less important, an increasingly sophisticated system for holding a tailless body upright without falling. The ancient appendage vanished, but its old work did not vanish with it. It was divided, reassigned, and embedded in structures that now define the human form. That helps explain why balance can feel so effortless and so precarious at once. Under normal conditions, the body performs its quiet corrections invisibly. Under strain, fatigue, injury, intoxication, disease, or age, the hidden labor becomes suddenly obvious. We wobble, we brace, we lean on walls, we fall. The stability of the human body was never a simple gift. It was built out of many systems working together because one ancient system had already been lost. And that loss is easier to appreciate when set beside other animals that solve the same problem differently. Evolution did not follow one universal path. Some lineages kept the tail and made it central, some reduced it, some turned it into a prop, a rudder, a signal, or a weapon. Humans belong to a lineage that surrendered the tail and then rebuilt equilibrium from the ground up. But we are only one version of the answer. To understand the hidden cost more fully, it helps to look sideways across the animal world and see how many other solutions existed, solutions our bodies left behind. Pain is one of the clearest ways the past makes itself known. It does not arrive with a fossil in hand or a gene sequence attached. It arrives in the ordinary language of the body stiffness, burning, pressure, weakness, a sudden electric line down the leg, a sharp ache when standing from a chair, a dull soreness that settles into the base of the spine and refuses to leave. Modern people tend to treat these sensations as personal failures of posture, age, fitness, or luck. Often they are shaped by all of those things, but beneath them lies an older reality. The human lower back is one of the most historically burdened regions in the body. It carries the legacy of a tailless ape made upright, loaded vertically, and asked to live for decades in ways evolution never precisely planned for. The tail we carry now is pain. That phrase may sound too severe, but only until one considers how common lower back trouble really is. Across the world, back pain is among the most frequent causes of disability and lost function. It affects manual labourers and office workers, athletes and sedentary adults, the young after injury and the old after years of accumulated strain. Sometimes the cause is obvious: a herniated disc, a fracture, a fall, a degenerative condition, a compressed nerve. Sometimes it is diffuse and frustrating, a blend of muscle tension, altered mechanics, inflammation, and no single clean lesion. Scholars still debate the precise weight of individual causes in many cases, because no single explanation fully accounts for lower back pain as a whole. But the broader pattern is unmistakable. Human beings have built their lives on a body whose lower spine works hard and fails often. The lumbar region sits at the center of that problem. These vertebrae are large because they must bear substantial load. They support the weight of the upper body and transmit force during walking, lifting, twisting, and bending. They also contribute to the forward curve that helps keep the torso balanced above the pelvis. That combination load-bearing plus mobility plus curvature is powerful but risky. A more rigid spine would resist some injuries but make movement harder. A more flexible spine would move well but buckle under load. The human lower back lives in between. It is strong enough to support upright life and flexible enough to let us work, turn, carry, and run. But it pays for that versatility with vulnerability. The intervertebral discs, those compressed cushions between the vertebrae, make this especially clear. They absorb shock and permit movement, yet over time they also dry, thin, bulge, or tear. When a disc herniates, material can press against nearby nerves, sending pain down the buttock and leg in the condition commonly called sciatica. This pain can be sudden, severe, and strangely revealing, because it shows how little room for error there is in the lower human spine. A small shift in tissue can turn an ordinary movement into agony. The body that walks continents and builds civilizations can be brought low by millimeters. Above and around these discs lies another layer of the hidden cost: the muscles. The lower back is not kept upright by bones alone. Deep stabilizing muscles, abdominal muscles, pelvic muscles, and the gluteal system all contribute to postural control. If one set weakens, others often compensate. If compensation persists too long, strain accumulates. This is one reason modern back pain can feel so confusing. The site of pain is not always the site of the original problem. tight hip flexors from prolonged sitting, weak gluteal support, poor trunk stability, reduced mobility in the thoracic spine, or fatigue in the feet can all shift extra burden into the lumbar region. The lower back becomes the body's reluctant negotiator, taking on forces other structures have failed to manage. The coccyx belongs to this zone of negotiation too, though in a quieter way. Tailbone pain, or coccydynia, is less common than general lumbar pain, but it has a distinctive bitterness because it can make one of the most basic human acts sitting uncomfortable or even miserable. A hard fall may bruise or displace the coccyx. Childbirth may injure it. Repetitive pressure from cycling, rowing, or prolonged seated work can inflame surrounding tissues. In some cases, no dramatic cause is obvious. The pain simply settles in, sharp when rising from a chair, dull when seated, persistent enough to turn a forgotten bone into a daily presence. This is the coccyx announcing that it is not merely a vestigial curiosity. It is still part of the living architecture of the body, and like much of that architecture, it can suffer. There is a revealing contrast between the coccyx and a true functional tail. A tail can move, shift, distribute momentum, and in some animals absorb or redirect certain forces through muscular action along its length. The coccyx cannot do this. It is a fixed terminal remnant. Pressure concentrates there more easily. Injury localizes there more easily. Evolution did not preserve the tail as a graceful posterior shock absorber. It left behind a compact anchor point exposed to the stresses of upright life and, in modern contexts, long periods of sitting on artificial surfaces. That is not failure in the moral sense. It is simply the outcome of a lineage solving one set of problems while inheriting another. A lesser-known detail is that some of the pain associated with the tailbone does not come from the bone itself so much as from the structures attached to it. Ligaments, pelvic floor muscles, and surrounding connective tissues can become strained or hypersensitive. Because the coccyx sits at the meeting point of these attachments, pain there can radiate or feel oddly diffuse. This is part of why coccydynia can be stubborn. The base of the spine is not an isolated endpoint. It is a crowded anatomical crossroads. The tail may be gone, but the old location where it once extended has become a contested zone of modern discomfort. The same is true, more broadly, of the sacrum and lower spine. The sacroiliac joints, where the sacrum meets the pelvis, can themselves become sources of pain or instability. These joints are designed to transfer force between trunk and legs while allowing only limited movement. Too much motion can be painful. Too little can also become a problem. Pregnancy, injury, asymmetrical loading, and muscular imbalance may all influence them. Again, the hidden cost is not one lost appendage acting alone. It is an entire lower body system reorganized after tail loss and then pushed further by bipedality, childbirth, aging, and modern behavior. Modern life magnifies some of these tensions in peculiar ways. Human bodies evolved under conditions of varied movement, walking, squatting, lifting irregular loads, climbing, resting on uneven surfaces, changing position often. Many people now spend long hours in chairs, in cars, in front of screens, or sleeping on soft surfaces that encourage poor spinal support. This does not mean back pain is purely modern. Skeletal remains suggest spinal degeneration and strain long before office work existed. But modern habits interact with ancient vulnerabilities in especially unhelpful ways. Sitting collapses the hip angle, can flatten or distort the lumbar curve, and increases pressure through the lower spine and coccyx. The body built for active balance is asked to remain still. The cost arrives slowly, then all at once. There is also age. Natural selection is often strongest on traits that affect survival and reproduction earlier in life. Many spinal problems become more common with age, after the crucial evolutionary work of passing on genes has already occurred. This means the body can remain deeply successful as an evolutionary design while still becoming unreliable later on. Discs degenerate, facet joints wear down, muscles weaken, bone density shifts, posture changes, the lower back, already operating with narrow tolerances, begins to show every old compromise more clearly. The tail we no longer have leaves its absence in the form of structures that age without ever having been truly overbuilt. And yet pain is not only damage, it is information. It tells us where the body's old solutions are under strain. The widespread nature of lower back pain suggests that the human form, for all its achievement, remains only conditionally stable. We balance brilliantly, but not effortlessly. We sit, lift, twist, and reproduce through a region of the body shaped by layered trade-offs. What survives in the record suggests that evolution accepted those trade-offs because the overall package worked. The species endured, the lineage spread, the body did enough. That may be the harshest lesson in the whole story. Evolution does not promise comfort. It does not promise that the most heavily used part of the body will be the safest or the least painful. It only promises that enough bodies will function well enough, long enough, under the conditions that matter most for survival and reproduction. Lower back pain, coccyx injury, pelvic strain, and spinal compression are not signs that evolution failed. They are signs of how ruthlessly limited its standards can be. There is even something almost symbolic in where this pain lives. It gathers at the very base of us, in the bones and tissues closest to the vanished tail. The body moves on, but its memory settles low. It sits where we sit. It flares when we lift, run, stumble, or give birth. It reminds us that the human story is written not only in brains and hands and language, but in a spine whose lower end never stopped negotiating with its own history. And the more one looks beyond the human body, the stranger that negotiation becomes. Because other animals solved balance, locomotion, and support in radically different ways. Some kept the tail and made it central to their success. Some turned it into a propulsive engine, some into a rudder, some into a social signal, some into a stabilizing pole. The human body chose another road, or rather inherited one, to see how contingent our own solution really is. It helps to step sideways and compare it with the bodies that kept what we lost. The easiest way to mistake the human body for a final design is to look only at humans. Seen in isolation, our anatomy can begin to feel inevitable, as if upright walking without a tail were the natural endpoint of mammalian evolution. But the animal world offers a sharper perspective. It shows that there was never one correct answer to the problem of movement, balance, and body control. There were many answers, built under different conditions, each carrying its own strengths and costs. Some lineages kept the tail and transformed it into a masterpiece of control. Some reduced it almost to nothing. Some made it a prop, some a rudder, some a weapon, some a signal. Humans belong to one peculiar solution among many, and the comparison is revealing precisely because it makes our own compromises look less necessary and more contingent. Consider the monkey first, because monkeys preserve something close to the ancestral primate condition that apes abandoned. A monkey moving through trees often carries its tail as an active balancing device. It helps shift the center of mass, fine-tune motion, and stabilize the body on narrow supports. In many species, the tail is expressive as well, contributing to posture, vigilance, and social signaling. In some New World monkeys, it becomes prehensile, so sensitive and muscular that it functions almost like an extra hand. This is not a marginal trick. It is a major locomotor resource. A spider monkey hanging and moving through the canopy with its tail involved is demonstrating just how far evolution can take an appendage humans no longer possess at all. That comparison matters because it destroys the idea that losing the tail was somehow a universal upgrade. For monkeys, the tail remains enormously useful. It supports a body plan built around arboreal agility, grasping, and fast balance correction. The human body did not leave the tail behind because tails were obsolete. It left the tail behind because our lineage moved into a different anatomical and ecological strategy. Monkeys prove that another path remained not only possible, but successful. Then there are the great apes, our closest living relatives, who are tailless like us yet solve many movement problems differently. Gibbons move through the canopy with extraordinary speed and grace using brachiation, swinging beneath branches with long arms and highly mobile shoulders. They need no tail to do this because the whole body has been reorganized around another solution. Orangutans, heavier and more deliberate, distribute their mass through careful climbing and flexible branch use. Chimpanzees and bonobos divide time between climbing and terrestrial movement, using their arms and trunk in ways humans no longer do. Gorillas, massive and largely ground-based, rely on powerful forelimbs and a different balance of body proportions. The taillessness they share with us is real, but what they do with the tailless body is not the same as what humans do. This is a crucial point. Tail loss does not dictate one inevitable outcome. It only sets constraints. Different ape lineages build different answers within them. Kangaroos make the contrast even more dramatic. Here is a mammal whose tail is not vestigial or secondary, but central to locomotion. It acts as a massive counterbalance during hopping, and even as a support or functional fifth limb during slower pentapedal movement. The tail helps bear weight, generate propulsion, and stabilize the body. In this lineage, the rear appendage has become a structural asset of the highest order. If one were to judge evolution by simple mechanical elegance, the kangaroo's tail might look like a better answer to certain balance problems than anything the human lower back can offer. And yet evolution did not send primates that way. It worked with another set of materials. Birds offer another kind of lesson. Modern birds do not have long bony tails like many of their dinosaur ancestors, but they retain tail feathers and fuse terminal skeletal elements that play major roles in steering, braking, and display. In flight especially, the tail becomes part of aerodynamic control. What matters here is not direct similarity to humans, but the broader principle when a structure changes. It is often reduced in one way and elaborated in another. The ancestral tail may shorten, but its function can persist in transformed form. Humans, by contrast, compress the tail region into the coccyx and redistribute most of its broader roles elsewhere in the body. We did not transform the tail into another external device. We internalized and dispersed its old work. Cheetahs reveal yet another possibility. Their tails operate as dynamic stabilizers during high-speed pursuit, helping them steer at velocities where momentum could easily throw the body out of control. A fast turn on open ground becomes possible because the tail can counter-rotate, allowing the animal to recover alignment almost instantly. Humans sprint without such an aid. Our arms swing, our trunk rotates, our feet adjust, and our nervous system coordinates balance. But the body lacks that rear lever of rapid correction. Again, this does not make humans inferior in any simple sense. It simply shows that our solution is one among many, and in certain specific tasks, other lineages have kept tools we no longer possess. Even animals whose tails seem less glamorous reveal how useful the structure can remain. A horse's tail is famous for swatting insects, but it also participates in communication and can influence posture. A cat uses the tail for balance and expressive signaling with extraordinary subtlety. A crocodile turns the tail into a propulsive engine in water. A beaver uses it in swimming, warning, and support. A scorpion, though not a vertebrate and therefore not part of the same anatomical story, reminds us how often evolution turns posterior appendages into central tools. The broader pattern is unmistakable. The rear extension of the body is a versatile canvas. Humans are unusual not because appendages behind the body are evolutionarily trivial, but because our lineage relinquished so much of that versatility. One lesser-known comparison involves arboreal marsupials and rodents, many of which use their tails as stabilizers or grasping aids without possessing primate hands or shoulders. This shows that tails can compensate for very different kinds of body plans. They are not tied to one specific anatomy. They are general-purpose assets that evolution repeatedly adapts to local needs. That makes the ape decision to lose the external tail even more striking. It means the lineage gave up something evolution had proven useful again and again across many mammalian experiments. Scholars still debate whether that sacrifice should be thought of mainly as a sacrifice at all. By the time the ape trunk, shoulder, and locomotor system were sufficiently transformed, the tail may no longer have been worth keeping. In that sense, other animals do not prove apes made a mistake. They simply show that different lineages preserved different options. The evidence remains incomplete regarding exactly how each comparison maps onto the ape and human story, because the ecological and anatomical contexts differ so much. But the comparisons are still valuable, because they strip away any illusion that our own body plan was the only path nature could have taken. They also clarify the human trade-off. Instead of a tail, humans rely on feet adapted for long-distance terrestrial efficiency, gluteal musculature specialized for stabilization and propulsion, spinal curves that manage upright load, and nervous control systems of immense sophistication. This package is highly effective for the ecological niche our ancestors eventually occupied. It supports endurance walking, running under certain conditions, carrying, throwing, tool use, and prolonged upright activity. But it does so by making the whole body responsible for tasks another lineage might solve with a more obvious rear appendage. Our solution is distributed rather than localized. It is powerful and fragile at once. There is something humbling in that. The human body can feel singular because so much of our history and culture has unfolded through it. But in anatomical terms, it's only one variation on ancient vertebrate themes. The tail is a reminder of how broad those themes once were. Other lineages kept it and thrived. We lost it and found another way. Neither path was destined. Neither path was universally superior. Each came with its own burdens and capabilities. What survived in the record suggests not a ladder of progress, but a branching field of experiments. This becomes clearer still when one imagines the human body restored with a functional tail, not as fantasy but as a biomechanical thought experiment. It might aid certain balances, perhaps alter pelvic mechanics, perhaps help in climbing, sitting, or rapid directional changes. But it would also require the rest of the body to be organized differently. Muscles, spine, sacrum, posture, even social signaling might shift. There is no simple way to add a tail back onto a human and call the body improved. The reason is that bodies are integrated systems. We lost the tail inside one package and compensated with another. The cost belongs to the package, not to a single missing piece. and that means the comparison with other animals is most useful not as a source of envy, but as a corrective to arrogance. Humans did not solve evolution. We solved our own problem temporarily. With the materials history left us, other species solved theirs differently. Some of these solutions look mechanically cleaner in certain respects. Some look stranger. Some carry costs we do not. The point is not that we should have remained monkeys or become kangaroos. It is that our anatomy is contingent, negotiated, and deeply specific. Once that becomes clear, the final pieces of the puzzle come into sharper focus. The tail is gone, but the fossil record, comparative anatomy, and genetics still allow us to reconstruct when that happened and how the evidence fits together. The picture is incomplete, as ancient pictures usually are, yet it is detailed enough to show that this disappearance was real, early, and consequential. To understand the full weight of the loss, it is time to gather those clues directly and ask what the bones and genes themselves can still tell us about the vanished appendage at the base of our story. The evidence does not survive in one place. It is scattered across fossils, embryos, genes, rare medical cases, comparative anatomy, and the lived mechanics of the human body. No ancient ape skeleton lies in the ground with every soft tissue preserved and every developmental secret intact. No fossil can show a vanished tail flicking through a Miocene forest, or reveal the exact timing of the mutation that helped erase it. The record remains incomplete, and scholars still debate important details. But enough survives, in enough different forms, to reconstruct the outline of what happened. The tail did not disappear as a late human novelty. It vanished earlier, deeper in ape history, and its loss can be traced through a network of clues that converge even when none is perfect by itself. The fossil record offers the broadest framework first. Early primates, judged through comparative anatomy, and the forms that branch near the base of primate evolution, are understood to have had tails. Monkeys retain them in abundance, making the ancestral condition clear. Apes, by contrast, do not. This sharp division suggests that tail loss occurs near the origin of the ape clade, rather than much later in the line leading specifically to humans. Fossils of early apes are often frustratingly incomplete, especially in the vertebral column, but what survives points toward bodies already departing from the monkey formula. The trunk broadens, the shoulders change, the lower back becomes relatively shorter, and the external tail is absent. In other words, humans inherit taillessness as apes inherit it, not as a sudden human invention. That distinction is one of the most important in the whole story. It is tempting to look at the human coccyx and imagine that our species alone somehow discarded the tail on the road to becoming upright and intelligent. The fossils do not support that. By the time hominins emerge, the line is already tailless. What our lineage later does is push that tailless ape body into full habitual bipedalism, amplifying the consequences of a much older loss. The fossil clue, then, is not a single dramatic specimen but the shape of the ape family tree itself. Humans sit inside a tailless branch, not at the start of one. Comparative anatomy reinforces that picture with unusual strength. The contrast between monkeys and apes is not merely the presence or absence of a visible tail. It includes differences in sacral structure, vertebral count, lumbar proportions, trunk shape, and locomotor design. In tailed primates, the vertebral column extends into a distinct series of caudal vertebrae. In apes, the terminal vertebrae are reduced, and the external appendage never appears. The rear of the body ends differently because the whole axial skeleton has been reorganized. This is important because it rules against simplistic ideas of the tail being somehow cut off evolutionarily, while everything else stayed the same. The body round the tail changed too. Bones testify to that. Embryology supplies another clue, one impossible to ignore once seen. Human embryos briefly form a tail-like extension during development, as do the embryos of other vertebrates. Later, this extension is reduced, leaving the coccyx and surrounding tissues as the adult endpoint. This means the developmental pathway that once built a full tail has not disappeared entirely. It remains embedded in the body plan, only to be revised before birth. That fact ties the fossil and anatomical evidence to a living process. It shows that the disappearance of the external tail is not a complete erasure of the old pattern, but a controlled interruption of it. Rare atavistic or tail-like births sharpen that clue further. They are unusual and medically complex, and many are better understood as developmental anomalies or pseudo-tails rather than true ancestral tails reborn. Yet they still matter. They show that the machinery underlying tail formation can, under certain circumstances, be partially re-expressed. The human blueprint still carries more of its past than the finished adult body openly admits. What survives in the record suggests that evolution changed the typical outcome of development, not the deep possibility from which that outcome is derived. Then there are the genes. In recent years, genetic evidence has moved the question from broad anatomy into specific developmental mechanisms. Research has pointed to changes in regulatory regions associated with the TBXT gene as a plausible contributor to tail reduction in apes. TBXT is involved in the formation of the posterior body axis across vertebrates, so a modification affecting its expression or interpretation during development could have large visible consequences. The details are intricate, and scientists are careful not to claim more than the evidence allows. One mutation alone does not explain an entire lineage's anatomy without context. But the importance of this clue is profound. It suggests a path by which tail loss could have originated developmentally, not through the invention of new body plans from nothing, but through altered regulation of ancient ones. A lesser-known but especially revealing aspect of this research is that the same developmental changes linked to tail reduction may also carry risks. Experimental work has suggested possible associations between tail-reducing mechanisms and increased susceptibility to neural tube defects when development goes wrong. The evidence remains incomplete, and it would be far too strong to say that one ancient mutation simply caused modern spinal disorders. Still, the possibility fits the broader theme of the whole story. Evolutionary transformations often arrive bundled with trade-offs. If tail loss spread through the ape lineage despite developmental risk, it likely did so because it fit or enabled a broader body plan successful enough to outweigh those dangers often enough. The genes do not just explain form, they hint at cost. The coccyx itself is another piece of evidence, and perhaps the most intimate one. It is easy to overlook because it is so reduced, but reduction is exactly the point. In humans and other apes, the coccyx consists of fused vertebrae at the terminal end of the spine, a remnant of the more extended caudal series seen in tailed relatives. It is not a full tail, but it is not a random bone cluster either. It is a compressed history. It retains attachment sites for muscles and ligaments, meaning it has been repurposed rather than abandoned. Comparative anatomy makes clear that this structure belongs to a lineage that once carried more behind it. The coccyx is evidence not because it is dramatic, but because it is precise. Fossils of early hominins add another layer. By the time species such as Australopithecus are walking upright with increasing commitment, the tail is long gone externally. The vertebral column, pelvis, and lower limbs show the strains and innovations of bipedalism, but they do so on top of a tailless ape framework. This matters because it locates the hidden cost historically. Human lower back vulnerability is not produced by a recent deletion from a previously ideal design. It emerges because a tailless trunk inherited from apes is being forced into the role of a fully habitual biped. The fossils do not show the tail disappearing at the human threshold. They show the consequences of its earlier disappearance playing out under new conditions. There is also the evidence of function. Biomechanics cannot fossilize, but living bodies and comparative studies allow scientists to infer how changes in the spine, pelvis, and trunk alter movement. The ape body supports climbing, suspension, and varied arboreal locomotion without a tail. The human body supports balance through feet, pelvis, spinal curves, gluteal muscles, and neural coordination. This functional evidence does not tell us exactly why the tail vanished, but it shows how bodies can remain viable after it does. It demonstrates that tail loss is mechanically plausible within certain body plans, especially once other structures evolve far enough to compensate. Evidence does not only explain the past by revealing what was, it also explains it by showing what could work. Scholars still debate the exact timing and sequence of all these changes. The Miocene fossil record is rich in some places and sparse in others. Early ape evolution remains a field full of unresolved relationships and incomplete skeletons. Developmental genetics is advancing rapidly, but the leap from laboratory models to deep time history must be made carefully. Embryology reveals ancestral traces, but not in a perfectly literal replay of evolution. Every source has limits. But that is the striking part. Even with these limits, the sources converge. Fossils place tail loss early in ape evolution. Comparative anatomy confirms the tailless ape body plan. Embryology shows the old tail forming and then receding. Genetics offers plausible mechanisms for the reduction. Rare developmental cases show the old potential has not vanished entirely. The coccyx preserves the remnant in adult form. No one clue is enough. Together, they are difficult to deny. That convergence also tells us something broader about human self-understanding. The past is not preserved only in ruins and sediment. It is preserved in developmental pathways, in small terminal bones, in patterns of pain, in the shape of the pelvis, in the frequency with which our lower back fails us, and in the fact that every human embryo briefly rebuilds part of a structure the adult body no longer displays. The evidence for the lost tail is therefore not only scientific but strangely personal. It sits inside the ordinary body, and from that body, the final meaning of the story becomes clearer. Tail loss was not an isolated curiosity. It was part of a chain of trade-offs that helped produce the human form itself. Once the tail disappeared, the trunk changed, balance was redistributed, bipedality later intensified the strain, childbirth narrowed its margins, and the modern lower back inherited all of it. The evidence is not only about when the tail was lost, it is about how a vanished appendage became woven into everything that followed. By the time the human story begins to look recognizably human, the tail is already ancient history in one sense and an active burden in another. It is gone from the visible body, gone from locomotion as an external tool, gone from the silhouette that marks most mammals against the sky. Yet it is still there as an absence the body must keep compensating for. And this is where the story deepens into something larger than anatomy. The loss of the tail is not just one quirky change among many. It belongs to the broader package of trade-offs that made our kind of life possible. A tailless ape body does not become human by adding one miracle after another. It becomes human by accepting one compromise after another, until the compromises themselves define the form. This is one of the hardest truths to hold on to when looking back at evolution. It is tempting to imagine the human body as a sequence of upgrades: hands freed, brain enlarged, posture upright, stride efficient, endurance improved, tools mastered, fire controlled. Each gain feels like movement toward greater power. But what survives in the record suggests a harsher pattern. Every gain enters the body through structures already constrained by older designs. A new possibility is purchased not with invention from nothing, but with a rearrangement of what already exists. The spine does not become a fresh engineering project when bipedalism intensifies. The pelvis is not redesigned cleanly for both walking and childbirth. The tail is not replaced by a superior universal mechanism. Instead, old elements are modified, repurposed, compressed, and forced into new relationships. Human evolution looks less like a staircase than a stack of bargains. The lost tail belongs to this stack in a foundational way. Once the ape lineage abandons the external tail, the base of the spine changes permanently. The rear counterweight many other animals still use is gone. The trunk must handle movement differently. The pelvis must anchor different patterns of muscle and force. Balance must be redistributed into feet, hips, spinal curves, and sensory control. This taillessness does not make humans by itself, but it shapes the starting conditions under which humanity later emerges. In that sense, one could say the human body is built not only on what it has, but on what it no longer has. Then comes upright walking, which takes the tailless ape body and pushes it into a more demanding arrangement than any other ape fully embraces. The hands become freer, the stride more economical over distance, the gaze more consistently elevated. These are enormous advantages. They help make later human behavior possible in ways difficult to overstate, but they also turn the lower back into a persistent negotiation between load and mobility. They force the pelvis into a new geometry. They make every step an act of controlled imbalance, and because the tail is no longer there as an external aid, these demands are carried by the rest of the body in distributed form. The cost is not local, it is systemic. Childbirth intensifies the trade-off even further. Here the story becomes almost brutally clear. As hominin brains enlarge over evolutionary time, infants must pass through a pelvis already shaped by bipedal demands. The result is not elegant. It is workable. Human birth remains unusually difficult and risky because selection is balancing competing pressures rather than solving them cleanly. The coccyx, modest though it is, belongs to that balancing act. It can move slightly during labour, adding a small measure of space, yet it also occupies a region where tension, strain, and injury can become personal and lasting. The hidden cost of tail loss is therefore bound not only to movement and posture, but to reproduction itself. A vanished appendage has become part of the architecture of one of the most difficult passages in human life. There is a revealing phrase often used in evolutionary biology trade-off. It sounds clinical, almost tidy. In practice, it means one part of the body or one stage of life gains something by pushing strain somewhere else. Large brains come with difficult births. Upright walking comes with bad backs. Reduced jaws come with impacted teeth. A tailless trunk comes with a reorganization of balance that may be effective but never entirely comfortable. Trade-off is simply the polite scientific word for the fact that evolution solves problems by moving them. The human body is full of moved problems. That is why the tail story feels so intimate. It is not isolated in remote prehistory. It is part of the lived logic of the body now. The lumbar spine aches because it is bearing a history, not just a workload. The pelvis carries pressure because it has been asked to do multiple incompatible jobs well enough rather than perfectly. The coccyx bruises and burns because the old tail has not been cleanly erased, only compressed into a less forgiving form. Even balance itself becomes part of the trade-off. Instead of a single posterior structure assisting with correction, the body relies on highly coordinated internal systems that work brilliantly under ordinary conditions and become fragile under fatigue, aging, disease, or injury. One lesser-known but telling detail is how often evolutionary success depends on tolerating flaws rather than eliminating them. Humans are extraordinarily successful as a species. We occupy almost every environment, reshape landscapes, build technologies, survive cold, heat, altitude, and distance. But species-level success does not imply individual anatomical comfort. It is entirely possible for a body to be astonishingly effective overall, while remaining full of points of failure. This is one reason modern people are sometimes surprised to learn how unoptimized the human spine truly is. We expect greatness to come with elegance. Evolution offers greatness with patches. And yet those patches matter because they also generated extraordinary consequences. Losing the tail may have helped fit the ape trunk to a different mode of movement. That tailless trunk, later made more fully bipedal, helped free the hands. Free hands interact with tool use. Tool use interacts with foraging, cooperation, defense, and eventually culture. Efficient terrestrial movement changes range and endurance. Pelvic redesign changes birth. Birth changes infant dependency. Infant dependency changes social structure. Social structure changes learning. Learning changes everything. The tail does not directly create civilization. Of course, that would be absurdly simple. But the loss belongs to a chain of bodily reorganizations without which the later human story would look very different. This is why the topic matters beyond curiosity. To ask how humans evolved without tails is really to ask how evolution builds transformative beings from compromised materials. It is a case study in emergence through limitation. The body does not become more capable by escaping constraint. It becomes more capable by turning one constraint into the foundation of another adaptation, then accepting the damage that follows. Scholars still debate the relative importance of each element in this process because no single explanation fully accounts for the human form. But the broad lesson stands. Our species is not the product of clean solutions. It is the product of layered tolerances. The tail's disappearance may also have shaped how later humans understood themselves, even if only unconsciously. We are a species unusually impressed by posture. Uprightness becomes a metaphor for dignity, order, authority, and self-control in many cultures. The straightened body is associated with civilization, adulthood, competence. Beneath that symbolism lies a physical reality more ambiguous than the symbolism admits. Uprightness is difficult. It is maintained against gravity by effort. It depends on a spine that can fail, a pelvis under strain, and a base where the memory of a lost tail still lingers as bone and pain. The noble posture is real, so is the cost of holding it. There is something almost poetic in that contradiction. The traits that help define humanity to itself are also the traits most marked by compromise. We stand tall because the body found a way to do so, not because it was ever guaranteed to do so gracefully. We move through the world without tails, without rear counterweights, without the old appendage that once belonged naturally to our ancestors. In its place we carry curves, muscles, coordination, childbirth difficulty, and chronic vulnerability. The body works, the body suffers, both are true at once. What survives in the record suggests that the human form cannot be understood by listing its advantages alone. The disadvantages are part of the same system, not unfortunate side notes. Tail loss is one of the clearest examples because it is so easy to underestimate. A missing appendage sounds minor until one follows its consequences through locomotion, development, balance, reproduction, and pain. Then it begins to look less like a small subtraction and more like one of the hidden hinges on which the body turned. And this leads naturally to the final perspective. The tail is gone, yet the absence remains active. It shapes the way we sit, walk, age, injure ourselves, and bring new life into the world. It is not simply a chapter in our ancestry, it is part of our present tense. To see that clearly is to realize that the lost tail is not just a story about what humans no longer are. It is a story about what humans still carry beneath every step, an ancient absence that helped make us, and never entirely stopped costing us. At the end of the story, what remains is not a tail but a kind of haunting. It lives in a few fused bones at the bottom of the spine, in the brief tail of the embryo, in the rare newborn whose body reveals an older instruction too clearly, in the ache that rises from the lower back after a long day, in the strange fact that one of the most successful mammals on Earth is built around a compromise so easy to overlook. The human body no longer carries a visible tail, yet it has never fully escaped the structure, the memory, or the consequences of having once belonged to a tailed world. The ancient absence remains beneath us, quiet and absolute. That may be the most important realization of all. Evolution did not simply remove a part and proceed cleanly onward. It changed the body's outline, then asked the rest of the body to take over the work. It compressed a tail into a coccyx, shifted balance into spinal curves and gluteal muscles, passed stability into the feet and the inner ear, and forced the pelvis to carry pressures its ancestors never knew in quite the same way. Later, when the human lineage rose more fully into habitual bipedalism, that old absence became more consequential still. The tailless ape body became the upright human body, and the cost multiplied through movement, posture, reproduction, and pain. This is why the tail matters even though it is gone. It is easy to treat vestiges as trivial curiosities, the decorative leftovers of a body plan history no longer relevant to the present. But the coccyx is not decorative, the embryonic tail is not decorative, lower back pain is not decorative, difficult childbirth is not decorative, balance itself in a tailless upright body is not decorative. These are not footnotes, they are daily facts of the human condition. What survives in the record suggests that the tail's disappearance belongs to the architecture of modern life far more deeply than most people ever suspect. It also reveals something larger about what it means to be human. We often tell the human story in terms of achievements, bigger brains, free hands, language, tools, migration, fire, memory, culture. These are real and they matter. But the body that made them possible is not a masterpiece of frictionless design. It is a body assembled from old parts under pressure. It is a body that carries its history in compressed form. The lost tail is one of the clearest examples because it sits at the intersection of so many themes at once: ancestry, development, locomotion, balance, childbirth, pain, and the uneasy logic of trade-offs. Scholars still debate the exact weighting of causes behind tail loss, and the evidence remains incomplete in the way deep evolutionary evidence often is. No single explanation fully accounts for why the external tail vanished from the ape lineage. It may have become less useful as locomotion changed. Developmental mutations may have altered the embryonic patterning of the body axis, trunk mechanics, body size, shifting arboreal behaviors, and broader anatomical reorganization may all have played their part. But whatever combination of forces drove the transition, the consequences are no longer abstract. They are written into us. The coccyx is perhaps the clearest symbol of that writing. It is small enough to seem minor, yet it anchors muscles that matter, participates in the pelvic floor, shifts during childbirth, bruises easily, hurts unexpectedly, and preserves the shape of a loss far older than humanity. It is the body's understated confession that modern anatomy is not original in the clean sense. It is inherited, it is modified, it is layered with compromise. The base of the spine is where one ancient solution ended and a more difficult one began. There is a temptation, at the end of such a story, to imagine what might have been different. A human with a functional tail is easy to picture in fiction, but far harder to imagine biologically, because the tail was never just an appendage floating outside the rest of the body. It belonged to a different balance of spine, pelvis, trunk, and movement. To keep it would have meant keeping much else or changing much else differently. The question, therefore, is not why humans are missing some optional ornament. The question is how the entire body was rebuilt after letting go of a structure that had once been normal, useful, and ancient. The answer is that it was rebuilt incompletely, brilliantly, and at a cost. That cost is not a tragedy in the simple sense. It is part of what made our form possible. Without the broader ape reorganization that included tail loss, the later human body would not have emerged in the same way. Without the later human reorganization of that tailless body, the hands would not have been freed in the same manner, the stride would not have become what it did, the relationship between pelvis and spine would not have created the same possibilities, and the history that followed might have belonged to another creature entirely. The ancient absence helped make us. It also left us vulnerable. Both truths belong together. So the hidden cost we still carry is not just pain, though pain is one of its clearest languages. It is the burden of living in a body that solves problems by redistributing them. It is the burden of a spine that must hold upright what a tail no longer supports. It is the burden of a pelvis caught between walking and birth. It is the burden of a developmental program that still begins to build a tail before the body folds that possibility away. It is the burden of history itself, pressed into anatomy. And perhaps that is why the story lingers, because it turns the familiar body strange again. It reminds us that even now, under clothing, under routine, under the ordinary assumption of being human, there remains an old design half visible in bone and motion. A vanished appendage still shapes how we stand in the world. The tail is gone, the cost remains, and at the very bottom of the spine, where the body narrows into its quietest remnant, evolution has left a final signature, not a flag of triumph, but a small and stubborn record of what had to be lost so that something else could begin. The body grows quiet when seen across enough time, not because its history becomes simpler, but because its strangeness settles into something almost calm. A tail once followed the line of the spine. It balanced small primates in trees, belonged naturally to the grammar of mammalian movement, and extended the body's reach behind itself. Then, somewhere in the long ape past, that shape began to change. The tail faded from view, the trunk reorganized, the spine ended differently. Later, a tailless ape stood more fully upright, and the old loss became part of a new burden. What remains now is modest, a coccyx hidden beneath muscle and skin, a brief tail in the embryo, a pressure at the base of the spine after too many hours seated, a difficult birth, a lower back that sometimes stiffens for reasons that seem immediate, but are older than memory. These things do not look like ancient history. Yet they are. There is something humbling in that. The human body often seems like a completed fact, as if it arrived finished and obvious. But it did not. It arrived through negotiation. It carries traces of structures it no longer shows. It keeps old instructions and interrupts them. It turns vanished anatomy into present function, and sometimes into present pain. It is less a final design than a long compromise still being lived. And so the lost tale becomes more than a curiosity. It becomes a quiet way of seeing the whole body differently, not as a perfect machine, and not as a failure, but as a survivor of deep time, carrying forward both gain and damage together. We walk upright across ground our ancestors never knew. We balance with muscles and nerves and curves of bone instead of the appendage they once carried. We call this normal because it is ours, but normal is only history that has become familiar. At the end of the story, the image narrows again to the base of the spine, a small remnant, a fused echo, the place where an ancient body plan still touches the modern one. Nothing moves there the way it once did, nothing waves behind us. Yet the silence is not empty. It is full of inheritance, full of the vanished line of a tale, full of the cost of becoming this kind of creature. And as the body settles, and the long arc of the story recedes into darkness, that small quiet bone remains, holding its place at the end of us like the last visible mark of a world we never entirely left.